Hi guys, this is Shadow. Join our Patreon and have access to tons of novels and hundreds of hours of audiobooks. Also, by selecting a tier monthly, you can request any novel you want and I can turn it to audiobook for you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy.
Chapter 301. The Tomb of Oracleus. 4. Within the small, empty room, the tomb stood eerily still, the purple words etched upon it glowing faintly in the dim light, casting a dim glow over the space, highlighting the faint cracks that webbed across the tombstone, like a spider's intricate design etched into the stone. Emmett Rowe. Leon repeated the name. It was an unfamiliar name, something he had never heard before and was seeing for the first time. Nonetheless, he started to understand something. Emmett Rowe was the seer's true name. Who? He took a deep breath, feeling his heart pound at his throat as he finally found a clue to the origins of the unrecorded. That strange world he had seen. Was that the world where the seer came from? A distant future? The more Leon thought about it, the more confused he became. Everything came to him so suddenly that he hardly had any time to properly sort out his thoughts. At least until a sudden smashing sound shattered the silence. Bang. Stunned, he turned toward the source of the noise and saw Julian furiously smashing the ground beneath the tombstone, his face numb to the point of indifference. Bang, bang. What are you doing? Leon hurriedly reached for him, but Julian shook his hand off and turned to face him. As Julian struck the ground, he simultaneously retrieved a small, familiar vial. The moment Leon caught sight of it, his expression shifted abruptly. That? He recognized the vial in seconds. How could he not react when he had been injected with that very same liquid back in the strange, cult-like environment? The memory of the experience sent a cold shiver down his spine as he recalled the numerous deaths he experienced. Immediately, Leon understood Julian's intentions. The thought made his jaw grow slack. Are you planning on reviving him? Yes. Julian nodded, smashing the ground again. You said that the blood of mortem is like an elixir. It can revive anyone as long as they take it, right? If that's the case, I'll use it on him. We'll be able to get answers this way. Bang. Julian once again smashed his fist against the ground. The tombstone trembled faintly, and the ground beneath Julian's fist began to cave in. Just as Julian raised his hand to strike again, Leon suddenly lunged forward, clasping his forearm tightly. Clack. Julian silently raised his head to look at Leon. Holding onto Julian's forearm, Leon's expression twisted. Stop. Why? Julian's voice came out chillingly cold, his eyes appearing hollow. Is something wrong with my plan? It won't work. The blood won't work. Julian stopped, his expression hard to read. What do you mean by that? His voice turned hoarse. Pursing his lips, Leon let go of Julian's hand. He then highlighted the obvious. It's been so long. Do you really think the blood will work? Julian remained silent, his eyes fixated on the tombstone. Leon could tell at a glance that Julian understood the concept all too well. Yet, despite that understanding, he still looked like he wanted to try it. There was a certain sense of desperation in his eyes that took Leon aback. Why was he like this? Why was... It then suddenly hit him. Did you manage to get a clue as to how you found yourself in Julian's body? Julian's silence spoke volumes, and Leon drew a cold breath. I see. Leon started to understand why Julian appeared so desperate. But, still stop. What if? It won't. Leon cut him off, grasping what Julian was trying to say. He understood it all too well. He still wanted to see if the blood would work. Despite the amount of time that had passed, he still believed it was possible to revive him. The power of mortem's blood was strong, and there was a slim chance that someone who had died for so long could be revived. Nonetheless, there was a problem with the entire thing. Regardless of what you do, it won't work. Why? Julian's brows twisted into a frown, his voice growing more hoarse. Why do you keep saying this? He was bordering on anger and frustration. That's when Leon turned his attention toward the grave with a complicated look. Because the blood of mortem doesn't work on him. Oh? Leon recalled some of the murals they had seen, particularly those beneath the well. One image stood out vividly in his mind. A man holding a dying person in his arms, his hand outstretched toward the man's mouth. Blood dripped from his hand as he desperately tried to bring it close enough to save him. The anguish and desperation were vivid in every stroke of the mural. the tears of blood streaming down his eyes further accentuating the desperation he felt. He didn't understand who the man in his grasp was, but now he had a faint idea. It's probably Oracleus. It was only one static frame, and yet the mural told more than 1,000 words, especially to Leon, who had a deeper understanding of the unrecorded. He knew that the unrecorded had all consumed the blood of mortem to increase their lifespan. All with the exception of Oracleus. He was the only one to die. But why? If he so desperately wanted to save Oracleus, why did he still die? An idea suddenly forged itself in his mind. It was a crazy idea, but upon thinking about it, he thought it was possible. What if? He held his breath at the thought. What if it's because they're related? Leon's words struck my mind like lightning bolts, paralyzing me with their intensity. I slowly turned my head to face him, the reality of the idea sinking into my mind. What did you just say? Leon appeared startled at first. Possible because he didn't think that he'd voice out his thoughts like that. But he eventually frowned and shared his thoughts. What if mortem and Oracleus are related? I found myself swallowing the musty, humid air of the environment. It felt suffocating, and I felt that my mouth had gone completely dry. I had long since lost any sensation of my heartbeat. Why? What makes you think that they're related? It's one of the only explanations. Leon went on to explain. The blood of mortem essentially regenerates a person's body down to the very last cell. As long as there's a single cell left, the blood can restore the body to its original state. We've both already experienced its miraculous effects, so you should know best. Leon gave me a certain look. I stood in silence as Leon started to ponder over his words. I'm not too familiar with the concept, but all of us have distinct marks that make us unique. DNA. The blood directly rebuilds the body from the ground up, creating an entirely new form based on the remains, using mortem's mark as a reference. But what if the mark is almost entirely similar to the one found in the cell? What would happen then? Ideally, it would be able to recreate it more easily. Ideally, yes, but... Leon paused, his expression growing more certain. I believe the concept is similar to how blood-related members can't reproduce with each other. There's a certain rejection that stops the blood from fusing. I pursed my lips, the words unable to leave my mouth. Leon stopped there as well. It's only a thought, but there's a chance mortem and Oracleus are related. Leon laughed a little as he looked at the tomb. It's quite sad if you think about it. Mortem. He's immortal, and he has the power to revive everyone in the entire world except... His hand traced over the tomb. His own family. Something squeezed tightly at my chest as I struggled to breathe properly. The more Leon talked, the deeper the pain in my chest became as I felt my mouth tremble. No, this is just a theory. It's not true. I tried my best to reject the entire notion. I didn't want to hear about it. I didn't want to believe it to be true. How could this be? How could this be? But the more I rejected it, the more I realized the possibility of it. Especially when I was made to recall a certain experience from not too long ago. During the time when we were abducted by the archpriest. Back then, we had all been subjected to the blood of mortem. I had been as well. At first, I wanted to scream at how I was still alive after being injected with the blood. But then I came to a realization. I'm in a different body. My genes were far different than that of Emmett's. It wouldn't be strange of the blood to work. I felt my breathing grow heavy. Ha! That's because I was reminded of something else. My memory loss. The world around me slowed down and my vision grew hazy. As I recalled the time at which I lost my memories, I came to one realization. I lost my memories right after the blood was injected into me. I swallowed quietly. Couldn't be a coincidence. Could it? Ha. I wanted to laugh, but my mouth refused to open. In recreating my entire body, the last thing I would have expected was for it to bring back the memories of my time as Emmett. It would make more sense if my memories became that of Julian, but the fact that the memories that I recalled were that of Emmett suggested one thing. Though it's very thin, there's a little bit of my old blood within me. But how? How was this possible? I clutched my head as a searing pain overwhelmed me, like a gigantic hammer relentlessly smashing against my skull, shattering it into fragments with each blow. Hey, are you okay? What brought me out of it was Leon as he tugged my shoulder lightly. I could hardly think or stand properly. My entire body was drenched in sweat, and as Leon looked at me, he tilted his head. Something has been off about you since we've entered this place. I know you've found something, but what is it? My mouth opened but no words came out. I thought about telling him everything that I knew, that I was Emmett Rowe, that there was a chance mortem was my brother, and that the world he saw was my world. But I stopped myself from doing so. How much did I truly know about Leon? He seemed to know quite a lot about the gods and unrecorded. It wasn't that I didn't trust him, but I didn't know him well enough to know his objectives. What if he had a grudge against the so-called unrecorded? At the same time, I also wasn't sure of what to make of what I was seeing. Holding onto my breath, I looked at the tombstone. Oracleus. Emmett Rowe. And then I looked at my hands. Am I really? Chapter 302. End of the first phase. 1. Thump, 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 thump. A pair of yellow eyes shone with grace, watching as several bodies around him collapsed, lifeless, to the ground. The bodies belonged to thin figures with long, sickly arms that unnervingly stretched down from their backs. Their bodies now motionless at his feet as their blood slowly seeped into the dry ground beneath, staining the earth with dark black color. But as if that wasn't enough, several dozen more of the same creatures surrounded him. They stood still, their vacant, empty eye sockets staring blankly in his direction from all sides. They were all alive, yet not a single one seemed capable of moving, as if frozen in place. How many does that make? Caius stretched his arm to the side. In a short few seconds, he felt something soft fall on his hand, and he brought it to his face. It makes it 23 at once. Oh, not bad. Caius wiped the sweat using the towel he received and tossed it back to Angela. Massaging his neck, he flicked his hand up. One of the wraiths that surrounded him lifted off the ground and floated before him. They're quite a bit weaker than I thought. Swiping his hand, the wraith's body turned and twisted in the air before it levitated right before him. Caius pinched his chin as he closely examined the corpse. It's been almost a week, and we're soon going to have to return. It's a bit of a pity if this is the little warm-up that we'll have to do before the second phase. Closing his hand, Caius watched as the wraith's body suddenly crumpled. The air filled with the sickening sound of bones cracking and twisting. J.R.A. crack. Within seconds, the wraith was reduced to a thin, compressed ball, which Caius casually dismissed with a flick of his finger. Boom! The ground shattered beneath the impact of the ball. Thump! Several bodies fell immediately after, their bodies torn in half, with the missing portions scattered like debris. Caius glanced around at the dozen or so wraiths surrounding him. The corner of his lips curled up slightly, a trace of amusement lingering on his lips. Raising his hand, Caius gave the wraiths back their ability to move. Instantly, they lunged at him from all sides, hundreds of arms reaching out for him and casting long and thin shadows over the area where he stood. He remained motionless with the same thin smile on his face as the hands covered him. Tilting his head slightly, Caius peered through the narrow gaps between the outstretched hands reaching for him. He fixed his gaze on the white sun hanging in the sky, his bright yellow pupils gleaming with an unsettling light. As he stared, something intangible began to expand from the ground beneath him, gradually enveloping his surroundings and the wraiths in a creeping, invisible force. Stop! As he spoke, his voice quietly layered as his surroundings froze. His face twitched slightly as he rubbed his head. It's not quite there. Scratching his head, a dome started to form over his surroundings. It slowly covered his surroundings but stopped halfway. Staring at the half-complete dome, Caius sighed. I'll get there soon enough, I guess. With a sigh, he pressed his hands together, and a fountain of black sprayed all over him. Basking in the blood of the wraiths, Caius took a step forward as the bodies collapsed alongside him. Thump, thump, thump. Without turning back, he quietly mumbled, "Let's go. We're going to be late at this rate. There's an interesting fellow I want to match up against. Though I'm not sure how entertaining our fight will be. In a different area." Crackle. A fire crackled as a man stood by, silently observing its dance with his cold, gray eyes. Beside him, a young woman with long platinum hair and piercing blue eyes sat. She wore silver armor that covered half of her chest and legs, reflecting the flickering light of the flames. Beside her were several other members of the same empire. "What are you thinking so deeply about, Amel?" Amel didn't answer, keeping his gaze fixed on the fire in front of him. Amel? It was only after Agatha spoke again that he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It's his birthday today. Ah! As if realizing what this was about, Agatha's expression changed subtly. The atmosphere surrounding the fire grew a little tense. This was a sour topic within the empire, something that the royal family refused to talk about and hid from the world. Everyone seemed to have forgotten. Everyone but Amel. He would have been about my age by now. It was regarding his brother's death. To this day, Amel refused to accept that his brother was dead. The body had never been found, and as long as there was no physical evidence, he clung to the belief that his brother was still alive. The harsh truth, however, was that what remained of his brother was probably nothing but ashes. The fire that raged on that day would have made it impossible for a young kid to escape. Agatha, his fiancée, and the future sword saintess of their empire knew the truth all too well but chose to remain silent. There was no use taking the idea off of his mind. To lighten up the mood, she tried to joke. Do you think he would have been as handsome as you? That did seem to work as Amel chuckled slightly. Probably not. Even if they were twins, he still believed he'd be better looking. But what brother didn't think they were more handsome than their brother? I don't know. Agatha tilted her head and looked to be in deep contemplation. Finally, Amel's expression changed as his head flicked in her direction. What are you thinking so deeply about? Agatha didn't answer and just stared into his eyes, her lips curling slightly. I don't know if you'd look better than your brother, to be honest. Ah, from what I heard, he takes more from your father than you did. Your father is pretty handsome, so? Agatha covered her lips and laughed. It's a tough one. What? What's so tough about it? Agatha shrugged. Whatever the case, he has the same gray eyes as yours. I'm sure he looks good. After all, those gray eyes of his, they were one of the distinctive features of the Verdant Empire royal family. I guess. Amel waved his hand and the fire faded. Standing up, he looked towards the others to make sure they were all well rested before nudging with his head. Let's go. We're almost there. H.A. Kalian's chest heaved with labored breaths, his entire body drenched in blood from head to toe. Surrounding him lay several scattered monsters, pieces of their bodies strewn across the ground. It was a devastating sight that would upset the weakest of stomachs. And yet, Kalian treated everything as if it were normal. No, he was used to such a scene. For as long as he could remember, his life had been like this. Alone and filled with blood. It was for that reason that he didn't think twice about betraying those within his empire. They'd do the same thing if they were in his position. Since birth, they had been taught the same thing over and over again. Strength first, everything else second. To be strong, he needed to live, so he never regretted his choices. This was the reality of his life. Taking a deep breath, Kalian raised his head as a smile graced his lips. I think I should be able to handle it now. Emotive magic. Ever since the incident at the strange, cult-like place, he had tormented himself day and night, hiring every emotive mage he could find to expose himself to their power. He ruthlessly subjected himself to it every second he could, to the point where he wished nothing but death on himself, but it was all worth it. He was confident in his ability to resist it for at least a few seconds. It wasn't much, but it was enough for him. Ruhar! A thunderous roar echoed in the distance. Turning his head, Kalian saw a gigantic, tiger-like monster with bat-like wings hurtling toward him at tremendous speed. His lips twisted into a cruel smile as he brought the leg of one of the monsters he had killed to his mouth and took a bite. Crunch. Staining his lips in blue, he tossed the leg to the side and rushed toward the approaching monster. With both hands outstretched, the ground cracked and splintered with each step he took, causing the surroundings to twist and distort wildly. HAA! Shouting at the top of his lungs, he grasped the tiger's massive paws, and a tremendous explosion erupted, reverberating through the surroundings and shattering the ground beneath them. For a brief second, the two remained in a stalemate like that before Kalian's entire body twisted, and he brought his hands down. Boom! With a pained wail, the tiger cried out, but before it could react further, Kalian's hand descended sharply, cleaving down toward its neck. Bert! A fountain of blood drowning his features. Kalian stood still as his chest heaved up and down unevenly. HA. Staring at the lifeless corpse before him, he quietly mumbled, "A few seconds, that's all I'll need." Without wiping the blood off his body, he slowly turned around and headed forward. Grimspire. The main plaza was deserted. It'd usually be filled with all sorts of people, chatting and purchasing goods for the merchants stationed by the sides. But today it was quiet. The reason for this was that today would be the day the participants of the summit would return. Standing on one of the balconies that overlooked the plaza from above, Delilah calmly gazed toward her surroundings. A certain, intangible tension lingered in the air as all eyes were on the plaza. While death was possible, all the participants were the cream of the crop. Death was quite rare given their skill level. The reason why everyone was so nervous was because there were only 48 spots available for the second phase. It was all on a first-come, first-served basis. In that sense, the tension stemmed from the fact that there was no equal number of participants for each empire. The country with the most participants would inevitably hold the advantage. It was for that reason that the atmosphere was tense. "Are you not nervous?" Sitting opposite Delilah was Atlas. As the two members of Haven, they naturally sat together. Delilah briefly glanced in his direction before shaking her head. "It doesn't matter." "Oh? Are you that confident that we'll have a lot of participants?" "No." Delilah turned her head and looked at him indifferently. "The number doesn't matter. We only need the right people to get at least one spot. Atlas smiled, turning his attention toward the plaza. I am of the same opinion. Chapter 303. End of the first phase. 2. The plaza was quiet. Not a sound could be heard. All eyes were toward the entrance of the plaza, awaiting the incoming participants to see who would make it to the second phase. Discussions were already starting amongst the upper echelon. Gale in particular looked nervous. She'll make it, right? He started to chew on his lips. I heard that she's the Black Star, so there should be no problems. Yeah, I've also taught her quite a bit myself, so I know her level, but she did spend quite a bit of time acting. Maybe she didn't pay much attention then and lagged behind others. What if she got a boyfriend? Then things will become even worse. Oh no, no, no. If she got a boyfriend, what do I do? Father will probably not care, but I care. She might get scammed given how innocent she is. Oh no. Gale's thoughts were a jumbled mess. He wasn't one to overthink often, but when it came down to his sister, he tended to overthink to the extreme. Almost to the point where one might think he was insane. Thankfully, he was able to hide his thoughts rather well as none of the people around him noticed any changes. Who do you think will arrive first? Alicia, the crown princess of the Verdant Empire, spoke in a quiet tone. Today, she was dressed in simple clothing. A light white shirt tucked into a pair of brown pants. Despite the simplicity of her clothing, a regal aura surrounded her, making her presence stand out from the rest. Her light red hair caught the sunlight, and her piercing blue eyes gazed intently at the plaza, her thoughts hard to read. I've got 2 cute little juniors from my empire. They're quite talented, but knowing them, they'll probably arrive a little later. Is that so? Gale tried to act engaged, but all he could think about was Aoife. Thankfully, he didn't need to think of what to say as Theron, Etheria's crown prince, lightly spoke. It should be Caius. Theron wore his usual thin smile, his deep yellow eyes glinting with a quiet pride as he casually brushed back his black hair. He was dressed in light, simple clothing, a black shirt and brown pants that, despite their simplicity, only served to enhance his striking appearance. With looks that didn't lose out to anyone, he leaned back in his chair with an air of confidence. Caius! Gale snapped out of it and finally turned his head in Theron's direction. There weren't many names that grabbed his attention, but if there was one name that could make him snap out of his thoughts about his sister, then it had to be Caius. Each empire had its own talents, but only a few truly stood out. Ranked first amongst the contestants, with a talent enough to rival Delilah's, he was a name that Gale couldn't forget. He therefore said, right, he could be a valid choice, but speed doesn't really matter. What matters is that they qualify for the second phase. That's true. I guess you have a point. Theron smiled and rested his cheek on his propped-up hand. Still, it's nice to be first, right? It's also nice to have a lot of the members be from the same empire. How funny would it be if they were all from the same empire? Theron laughed lightly. It would be funny, but you know that's not possible. The contestants were scattered quite far from each other. While they could see their exact locations, trying to join up together was an impossible task since there was no means of communication. It's a pity. Gale smiled while turning his attention back to the entrance of the plaza. I'll be happy with just a few. The Nuz and Sifa Empire was usually ranked last in the summit events. It was something that was attributed to their policies in order to keep the royal family in power. Gale understood this all too well and felt a pang of guilt, but it was necessary to maintain their strength and prevent a coup d'état. Of all the 4 empires, their empire was the most balanced empire. They didn't need to worry about internal fights and squabbles like the other empires, allowing them to focus all their attention on the mirror dimension. Throughout the years, with the lack of internal fighting, they were able to become the strongest empire. While their general individual battle strength was indeed weaker than some of the other empires, it wasn't divided into different factions like theirs. This was what truly made them stronger than the other empires. Oh, someone is coming. As Alicia pointed out, toward the entrance of the plaza, 2 silhouettes appeared. Their features were hard to see, but as they appeared, the smile on Theron's face thickened. See? They're indeed quite fast. He laughed lightly, finally stepping into the plaza. A young man with striking blonde hair and deep yellow eyes made his entrance. The white sun hanging behind him cast a brilliant glow, accentuating his presence. He surveyed the area with a satisfied smile before turning to face the girl behind him to mouth a few words, most probably about how they had come first. Not that it wasn't expected. Gale ignored him and continued to keep his attention fixed toward the entrance. With the aid of the map, he was able to see that more and more dots were starting to near the area. It was only a matter of time before the plaza would be flooded. Oh wow! As anticipated, moments after Caius's appearance, several other figures emerged from behind them. Leading them were 2 figures. With deep gray eyes, coupled with his appearance and the appearance of the girl beside him, it was hard not to notice them. At the same time, Over half a dozen figures appeared behind them, walking solemnly and further adding to the tense atmosphere. Their presence took over the entire plaza. Clap, clap. Alicia clapped her hands joyfully. They were members of her own empire. In total, there were 8, and Alicia looked extremely happy with the outcome. Following their appearance, more and more participants started to show up. The next figure to emerge was difficult to recognize. His entire body was covered in scratches and smeared with blood, his long hair obscuring his face. Despite his disheveled appearance, Lucian's satisfied grunt confirmed that he was indeed someone from the Aurora Empire. Gale, who was familiar with most top profiles, was more or less able to guess who it was. Their top-ranked prospect, Kalian. Still, nobody? Gale looked at the plaza. There were now 20 people, and there had yet to be one from his empire. He was starting to grow worried. Surely, his eyes lit up brightly as he noticed a couple of figures approaching. In particular, his eyes were set on the young girl with familiar red hair and yellow eyes. Gale's chest swelled with pride the moment he saw her. Though he had maintained a calm exterior, beneath it, he had been anything but calm. Her presence eased much of the stress and worry that had been weighing on him. Trailing behind her was someone with striking purple hair. The two moved forward in silence, not exchanging a single word. But their arrival captured the attention of everyone in the plaza. It looks like there's someone from each empire. Alicia was the most satisfied at the moment. The current ratio was 11 from the Verdant Empire, 3 for the Etheria Empire, 6 from the Aurora Empire, and 2 from the Nazensifa Empire. Her empire was leading quite well, and so how could she not be happy? Hee, this is good. But her happiness didn't last for very long. Just as she began boasting, a group of half a dozen figures appeared at the entrance of the plaza. They're from my empire. Leading the group was a girl with striking platinum-colored hair and deep red eyes. There was a certain calmness in her gaze that made her stand out from the rest. Flanking her were several figures from various academies across the empire, each one following her quietly. There were a total of 7 of them, adding up to 9 from their empire. While they still weren't first, this was a lot more than anyone had anticipated as the surroundings grew a little quiet. There were now 29 participants already. This meant that there were only 19 spots left. Suddenly, the surroundings grew tense. All eyes were on the plaza. What would the final ratio be? In a different corner, Delilah and Atlas observed the newly arrived members. Atlas's face was lit with a smile, while Delilah's expression remained impassive. However, a keen observer would catch a subtle glint in her eyes as she set her gaze upon the figures from their empire. If Julian had been present, he'd have been able to tell what she was currently feeling. Satisfaction. Just because she did what she did in the past didn't mean that she hated her empire. Contrary, she was quite happy with it. It was just that she cared more about her cadets. 2 more have entered. Time is getting shorter. Atlas murmured while taking a sip of his tea. Delilah kept her gaze on the plaza as she silently pursed her lips. Their empire had now a total of 9 spots. This was a good number, especially when considering that in the past they only held between 4 and 5. It was much higher than before, but there was a problem. If Julian and Leon don't hurry up soon, they might not qualify for the second phase. That would be a little problematic. Indeed, the problem was that Julian and Leon, their 2 best members, were nowhere near in sight. Did something happen? Delilah glanced at the map but quickly closed it again. All she saw were dots, and she didn't know which one belonged to Julian and Leon. The first phase was always like this. It was only when the second phase started that everyone would get to see the broadcast and progress of the participants. Delilah felt a slight sense of unease as she looked at the entrance. There's 11 more spots left. Atlas's words from beside her were like an alarm that reminded her of the dwindling time that was left before the 2 of them would fail to qualify. 9 spots. Thin webs formed across the teacup in her hand. Unknowingly, she was starting to lose control of her power. 6 spots. Delilah let go of the cup and started to stand up. Her expression was colder than it had ever been. 5 spots. Atlas's voice continued to faintly echo as she found herself standing up. "F.O. Would you look at that?" He suddenly laughed, and Delilah's head flicked toward the entrance of the plaza. "Those 2 have finally decided to show up." Her eyes paused on 2 figures. They looked like a total mess, with their hair scattered and their clothes ripped. In particular, Julian. He looked to be in the worst state. Something twitched within Delilah as she sat back down. "Is everything all right?" Noticing the peculiarity in Delilah's expression, Atlas turned to look at her. She didn't answer and rummaged through her pocket before taking out a small chocolate bar. Her face contorted with a mix of longing and pain as she glanced at it. But after a moment's struggle, she managed to set it aside. "Atlas, aware of her complicated relationship with chocolate, given how they both attended Haven at the same time, tilted his head in curiosity. Are you not going to eat it? No. Saving it for later? No. Atlas frowned. Then? Not for me. Following the strange silence, Delilah raised her head to look at Atlas, who for the first time she had known him was looking at her with wide eyes. He appeared to be in slight shock. She frowned. Why are you looking at me like that? But Atlas didn't answer. His shock was hard to describe. Was this really the same Delilah that would rather die than share her chocolate? Chapter 304. End of the first phase. 3. Leon and Julian walked in silence. As they stepped into the plaza, over a dozen pairs of eyes immediately fixed on them, each gaze carrying a mix of curiosity, surprise, and something else that Leon couldn't quite determine. We've made it in time. Leon sighed in relief. They had been dangerously close to running late. Thankfully, the two of them together were pretty fast and were able to surpass the others that were approaching. Gatekeeping was also not allowed, and hence, they had no choice but to be very fast. Who? Leon found his gaze pausing in a certain direction, and he felt his shoulder lighten considerably. There's more than I anticipated. He could count over a dozen people from their side. 11 to be exact, and with the two of them combined, they'd be at 13. This was a number that was way higher than originally anticipated. With that being said, Leon's expression turned serious shortly after. The numbers were nice, but what mattered was the overall ranking. At least that was as far as he was aware. Let's go. He nudged Julian with his head. The entire time, Julian remained quiet and didn't say a word. With a mere nod, he followed along with Leon's words and moved. Leon stared at Julian's back with a complicated expression. He had been like this for the past few days. Since leaving the tomb, he had changed. He started to speak less, and he always seemed to be in thought. He looked like a shell of himself. Leon tried to get something out of him, to get an idea of what he saw, but Julian refused to budge each time. He simply didn't want to talk about it. In the end, Leon let him be and didn't press further. Everyone had their own secrets, and so did he. In fact, he had quite a fair share of his own secrets that he couldn't divulge. For that reason, he could understand where Julian was coming from. With that being said, he was a little worried. He had never seen this new Julian act like this before. Leon was also worried about the upcoming second phase. In his current state, Julian was set to lose within the first few rounds. Hopefully he recovers soon. Things would certainly be a little problematic if he wasn't in top condition for the second phase. Leon did after all believe that Julian had the necessary strength to reach the top in case he failed. Nonetheless, while Leon was worried, he wasn't too worried. While Julian didn't look to be in the right state of mind, that came more from the shock of whatever he learned than anything else. At the end of the day, it was only just shock. He didn't seem to have given up on his life or appeared to have some sort of brain trauma. Leon believed he just needed time to process the situation. Whatever he saw, it needed time to sort through. You guys have finally arrived. Greeting the two of them was Aoife, who distanced herself from the main group, alternating her gaze between the two of them. It seems like you guys met up with a lot of trouble. She pointedly looked at their clothes, which were a mess. Julian's in particular was quite bad. But thinking back at what they faced, Leon couldn't help but shrug. We did. But we managed to get around. That bad? Pretty bad. All right. Aoife took her eyes away from them and pointed at the group. Everyone is already here. With you two, we have 13 people. We're doing considerably better than the previous years. I saw. Leon nodded quietly while joining the group and greeting the familiar-looking faces. He knew pretty much everyone present. Kira, Josephine, Evelyn, Luxon, and the members from the other academies. Sharing a few pleasantries with them, he was just about to say more when a voice boomed throughout the plaza. The first phase has officially ended. The gates will now close. Clank, clank. A loud rattling reverberated through the plaza as the gates began to close, their heavy clang sealing off any further entry. The sound drew everyone's attention, and beyond the bars of the gates, they could see the despair etched on the faces of several participants who had just arrived, only to realize they were too late. Clank. Leon drew in a cold breath as the gates came to a close, marking the end of the first phase. Following this, the voice boomed again. The second phase will begin shortly. Please take the time that you have right now to rest. It disappeared shortly after that, leaving everyone confused. Rest now? How much time do we have? We just came back. Surely they'll give us a little bit more time to rest. My shoulder is injured. Can I get something to heal it? How long do we have to wait? Confusion started to spread amongst the contestants. How could it not? Not only did they not know who had spoken, but they had also been told little to no information about the upcoming phase. How was this fair? What sort of situation was this? What should we do? Leon turned to face Aoife, who pinched her chin and fell into thought. She looked behind her for a brief moment, her gaze falling on Kira, who looked unusually quiet. She thought about talking to her but stopped herself before sitting down on the ground. What else? She pointed toward those from the members of the other empires. Since we don't know how much time we have, the only choice we have is to follow what the others are doing and just rest. Get into top condition before the second phase. Aoife closed her eyes after saying her piece. She looked to be in a meditative state, trying her best to recover her energies while she had time. Leon looked around for a brief moment, his eyes settling over to Julian, who was still in his weird state. In the end, with a long and tired sigh, he went along with what Aoife said and sat down on the ground. I guess she's right. He closed his eyes and started to recuperate his strength. How long should we give them? They look quite worn out. Some even have slight injuries. It would be good if we gave them enough time. 1 hour. A deep and cold voice echoed amidst the discussions that were happening. Gale and Alicia turned to their left, where Lucian sat quietly. His face, as usual, remained impassive, his keen eyes fixed on the plaza. Lucian wasn't one for many words, but when he did speak, his decisions were always final. He was a stubborn man, and all those present knew this. Why do you say 1 hour? Theron seemed amused by the suggestion as he propped his chin up to get a better look at Lucian, who, despite sitting like him, towered over everyone. There's 2 reasons, really. Lucian spoke, his voice sounding extremely deep. Firstly, I've already waited too long. This has been dragging too much. Who? Gale covered his mouth to hide his laughter. He was the only one who found it funny, as Theron's and Alicia's expressions were stoic, hiding any trace of what they truly felt. Secondly, I don't see anyone with major injuries. If it's nothing major, I don't see how we can't start this. If they can't handle a little pain, they don't deserve to be here. Theron remained quiet, his head slowly turning and fixing on Caius. There were a few others gathered around him, and it was true. While they did sustain some injuries, it was nothing major. The same was true for everyone else that was present. You're right. Upon realizing this, he no longer argued and ended up nodding his head. We can do it like that. Lucian turned to look at Alicia, who gently sighed and leaned back. My side is okay with it too. Then all eyes fell on Gale. He was in a bit of a stump. From his side, everyone looked to be fine. Everyone but one person. Julian Dacre Ivinus. He seemed out of it of some sort. While his body didn't seem to have any injuries, his mind wasn't there, and it was quite obvious with how he was the only one that was still standing. What should I do? Since Julian was from his empire, Gale had an understanding of him. Ranked around the 30s, he was a promising talent that only lagged behind Aoife and Leon. At least, that was how it seemed on the surface. He had received some news regarding a certain performance he had with the vice-chancellor of the Bremer Central Academy. His strength was not as it was shown on paper. Having him not fight properly would be detrimental to their chances of victory. But at the same time, he wasn't sure his refusal would get him anywhere. Turning his head and seeing everyone else looking at him, he chewed over his words. What should I do? Closing his eyes, he shifted his attention towards Julian. He pondered for a brief moment, and just as he was about to come out with his decision, his expression shifted. Ever since I learned about the tomb, my thoughts have been a mess. I was in utter confusion, and questions popped up one after another in my mind. It got to the point where my head started to hurt and I could hardly concentrate. For that reason, I chose to seal most of my emotions. Fear, anger, sadness, joy. I sealed everything that I could so that I could logically sort through my thoughts. It was only then that I was able to coolly process all the information that I had managed to grasp. From that point, I came to an understanding. I'm missing a good chunk of my memories. No matter how much I sorted through my memories, there was no hint of anything with regard to the word Oracleus, or anything related to the unrecorded or events on the murals. There was something critical within my memories that I was missing. But why? Why were some of my memories missing? Who could be responsible for all of this? My brother? My mind shook, rattling the chains that were keeping my emotions locked. The thought of my brother being responsible for all of this and being in this world shook whatever I was trying to keep close. For the first time since appearing in this world, I had finally found a clue about him. Mortem. It wasn't in the way that I thought I'd hear. In some way, he found himself in this world as well. He gained immortal powers, allowing his blood to heal anything that got in touch with it. It's quite sad if you think about it. Mortem. He's immortal, and he has the power to revive everyone in the entire world except his own family. The words that Leon had previously said to me were still engraved in my mind, and they continued to linger there, continuously haunting my mind every second of the day. The possibility of his words being true ate at my consciousness. What sort of curse was this? I needed to find him. But how could I do that? How could I find Mortem? My head yet again throbbed, and the chains rattled further. There was so much to think about, and my thoughts were starting to mix with each other. I didn't know where to start, and the thought was eating away at my sanity. I was growing impatient, and I wanted answers. I needed an talk. Out of nowhere, something struck the top of my head, causing me to instinctively duck. Tack. Shortly after, a familiar-looking bar fell on the floor. It was a bar that could only be found in the Haven Shop and Lens, the city near Haven. I stood in silence for a brief moment before picking up the bar. This is? I turned my head to look behind me, in search of a certain someone. However, looking around, I couldn't find the person I was looking for. Strange. Did it slip her hand? No, if it slipped then she'd have teleported here and taken it back. Crazy to think about, but she would definitely do that. The lock rattled. Since it wasn't an accident, maybe she's giving it to me? The lock rattled again. No way, right? Delilah was someone who would rather die than share her chocolate. The thought of sharing her chocolate was worse than dying to her. And yet, maybe it's not hers? I flipped the bar back and saw a few words written in red. Eat it. It's her. Nobody besides her had such bad handwriting. I don't really like sweets, to be honest. I couldn't handle sweet stuff. And yet, despite knowing this, I still ended up opening the bar. For some reason, I just felt like eating it. Or at least, this was how I felt at first. The bar, it was actually already open. Peeling the wrapper to get a better look at what was inside, I found myself at a loss for words as the lock rattled even more fiercely. It was on the verge of breaking. The bar, there was only one cube left. What remained was the small tray that kept the wrapper in shape. Staring at the single cube that remained, I felt my expression twitch. This, CRA crack. Suddenly, the lock shattered, and I hunched over as a torrent of emotions surged through my mind. Anger, sadness, but one emotion overwhelmed them all. PFTT. I burst out laughing. Chapter 305. End of the first phase. 4. Let's start it in an hour. Seeing the sudden turnaround in Julian's behavior, Gail sighed in relief and decided to go along with the others' decision. All right, and so, with that, an hour was given for the participants to rest before the start of the second phase. Once everything was in place, they relayed the information to several key figures. The first phase was designed to filter out the truly powerful participants from the rest, while the second phase aimed to display the strength and potential of each empire's future leaders. It was an event that was typically broadcast across all 4 empires for everyone to witness. Everyone get ready. Get ready to start the broadcast in exactly an hour. Make sure that everything is ready. Each empire had its own dedicated broadcasting agency. They would broadcast the entire event from the main channel, free for all citizens to watch. News of the start of the event was already making waves in all 4 empires. The 4 Empire Summit was a famous event that was known throughout each of the 4 empires and was something that everyone eagerly anticipated to watch. Which empire didn't want to see its own empire come out on top? Pubs started to fill, plazas started to fill, and gradually the atmosphere around each empire started to liven up. Asterisk. Ivinus household. News of the event had also reached their households. Aldrich, Julian's father, was particularly interested in the summit. It wasn't so much because his son had made it to the squad, but more because he'd be able to familiarize himself with the talents within the empire. If possible, he'd like to recruit talented young prodigies to his household in order to increase their status, just as he had once done for Leon a long time ago. It should be starting soon. An aged voice echoed quietly from behind Aldrich. Placing his pen down, Aldrich turned his head to meet the eyes of an elderly figure with a thinning mustache and well-kept hair. He wore a typical butler uniform and met Aldrich's gaze with a calm expression. He was Dorian, once a loyal knight, now turned butler. Dorian was one of the few people that Aldrich trusted completely. He didn't even trust his own children as much as he did with Dorian. The young master and Leon will be participating soon. That's only on the premise that they make it to the second phase. Aldrich shut down the butler's words. He was very familiar with how the system worked, and just because Julian and Leon had made it to the main team didn't mean that they would make it to the main round. Only the cream of the crop could make it to the final phase. Do you not have much faith in the young master and Leon? From the reports, the 2 of them are doing splendidly in the... That is none of my concern. Aldrich once again cut Dorian off. Drumming his fingers against the polished wooden table, he leaned back on his chair. Doing well at an academy is completely different than doing well outside of an academy. Furthermore, I've watched the 2 of them grow up. I know what they're capable of. I do believe Leon will make it, but I'm not so sure about Julian. Listening to Aldrich's words, Dorian didn't say anything and just smiled. The master's words were true to some extent. He too had closely monitored the young master and Leon since young. He knew of their capabilities and was well aware that it was almost impossible for them to make it to the second phase. Leon can definitely make it, but what about the young master? The young master wasn't untalented. No, he was quite talented. He wasn't a prodigy, but he was also above the others when it came to talent. But he had one major flaw. He's obsessed with the sword, to the point where after a certain point, he refused to have anything to do with the talents he had been bestowed, only training with the sword. Night and day he'd train with the sword as if there was no tomorrow. Dorian had watched his desperate struggle for a very long time, pleading for him to stop, as that would only stunt his future, and this was now the best time for him to train. But he never listened. He kept at it with the sword, and his personality started to change. In the end, they could only give up and let him be. He was the total opposite of Leon, who was talented with the sword and actually stuck to it. With time, his talent started to bloom, and it wasn't long before everyone was aware of what sort of monster they were taking care of. Even after they heard about Julian's accomplishments from Haven and saw the broadcast, they still weren't confident in his abilities. If only he had trained earlier, perhaps then the master would have more confidence in his own son. Where is Linus? HM? The second young master. Yes. He should be in his room, Dorian answered after a brief pause. Aldrich nodded after a brief pause and brought his hand forward, nudging his finger. Tell him to come here. For? The summit. Aldrich answered flatly, pressing his hand against a small cube on his desk which lit up to display a large screen. I'll have him watch the event with me. Grimspire. Main Plaza. Rattle. 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 It happened abruptly. I didn't have the time to properly process what was happening before a sudden rattling sound echoed in the air. It was reminiscent of a series of chains pressing and grinding against one another. What? What's going on? Confusion took over the plaza as everyone stood up from the spots, raising their heads to look around the plaza to better understand the situation that was unfolding. Just moments prior, everyone had been recuperating their injuries when everything started to change. But not all looked confused. Raising his head up, Caius smiled. Is it starting? Rattle. The rattling grew louder and more chaotic, filling the air with an unnerving noise. I barely had time to process what was happening before a thick chain sprang up from the ground with a loud clank. CLA clank. It wasn't just one chain. Dozens of them shot up in quick succession, their metallic links grinding against each other as they soared toward the sky. Rumble. Rumble. The ground beneath me trembled violently, almost throwing me off balance. As I steadied myself, I noticed that despite the chaos, everyone around me seemed unusually calm, their eyes fixated on the hand of independence that stood at the center of the plaza. I recalled all the information that I knew about it, from how it had been here since the formation of Grimspire to how it had been too fragile for people to dig around it. At least that was what I thought at first. Rumble. The hand, once something I thought was just there for decoration, began to shake violently. Around it, small, hovering devices, recording devices, captured the unfolding scene for the world to see. The chains continued to rise, and the ground shook even more fiercely. Then the hand began to move. It rose slowly at first, revealing the massive arm attached to it. With pieces of metal dangling loosely, the arm was in a sorry state, its entire body corroded into a dull greenish hue, marred by deep fractures. CRA crack. The ground beneath me cracked, the fissures spreading across the plaza like a web until they reached the municipal building where they finally stopped. I stepped back further. Clank. A loud mechanical sound echoed through the air as the hand ascended further, revealing more of the arm. My breath caught in my throat as I fixed my gaze on the slowly unfurling statue. A thought crossed my mind. So it wasn't because they couldn't dig it out, but rather, it's because they were waiting for this moment to show it. Was it all for this moment? Rust and signs of wear marred the arm, with some parts missing entirely, exposing the skeletal structure beneath. As the hand continued to rise, several long spikes emerged from the ground just a little bit to its right, forming a jagged, broken crown atop a head. The crown and the face beneath it were both in a sorry state. Half of the statue's face was missing, with only thin metal lines outlining where the missing pieces once were. My heart pounded in my chest as the face of the statue started to reveal itself. I was curious. Just what sort of statue was this? And why did it look so familiar? The thought took my breath away. Clank. Clank. The chains that had shot into the air fell back down, coiling around the statue's form like serpents, binding it as it rose up from the ground. The chains connected the statue with the surrounding plaza, planting themselves onto the ground. As they planted themselves firmly, the plaza itself seemed to pulse with faint, dark energy as a dim purple glow manifested around them, displaying several runes that slowly started to light up. Rumble. Rumble. As the chains locked into place, securing the statue from all sides, its rise quickened, and its eyes gradually came into view for everyone to see. It soon became clear that the statue depicted a woman, with patches of soil and debris clinging to her face, partially obscuring her features. But the debris and soil soon fell to the ground, allowing everyone to see her face. I saw it too, and my mind blanked. Rumble. The more it rose, the more imposing the statue appeared as it cast a long shadow over the large plaza. Everyone looked impressed by what they were seeing, some even clapping at the sight, but I couldn't muster a single thought. Not one. How? When I snapped out of it, my thoughts were in a mess. My chest trembled as I unconsciously took a step back, my gaze remaining locked on the statue rising before my very eyes. How is it here? That statue. No wonder it felt so familiar. It was none other than the Statue of Liberty. Chapter 306. First Opponent, 1. Rumble. The plaza continued to tremble as the worn-out statue finally emerged in full view for everyone to see. Major portions of its structure were torn away, with fragments dangling down, revealing the skeletal framework beneath. It was an imposing sight that left many of the onlookers breathless. For the first time since the creation of Grimspire, the complete form of the Hand of Liberation was unveiled to the world. The plaza was silenced. The empires were silenced. The world was silenced. All eyes were fixed on the majestic statue that stood at the heart of the plaza. Rattle, rattle. In the silence, only the rattling of the chains echoed through the air. The cracks that had formed on the ground began to mend, and gradually, everything returned to its original state. All except for the statue, which now stood proudly and imposingly at the center of it all. This is crazy. How could it be like this? The faint sound of whispers quietly spread throughout the entire plaza as everyone started to talk about the statue and its possible origins. At least, that was what I managed to gather. I couldn't focus properly. My thoughts were a jumbled mess that I couldn't organize. The only reason I was able to keep calm was because of the lock that was sealing my emotions. But even that was rattling wildly. This was still a new ability that I had developed and needed more time to master. I was certain that it'd soon turn into an original spell, but it was just not quite there yet. I once again brought my thoughts back to the statue. The lock rattled with each glance that I took, forcing me to look away for good after a few sparing glances. Can this be a game setting? The thought of the mirror dimension being Earth had crossed my mind multiple times. I wasn't stupid. The thought had crossed my mind from the moment I learned about English and how it had been found in the mirror dimension. It was just that I didn't want to believe in such a possibility. I denied the reality and associated it with the thought of it being an Easter egg for the game. The thought crossed my mind for a brief instant as the statue appeared, and I wanted to believe that to be the case. But who? I was reminded of a certain grave. Emmett Rowe. I never played the game, nor had I ever imputed my name in it. The answer was obvious. This was no Easter egg. It was real. The lock rattled fiercely. There's a chance this isn't a game. Certain elements pointed out at this being a game. The quest system, the experience gains, and the strange medieval world. But there were other aspects that made it seem as though this wasn't a game but real life. A very distant life with an uncertain history. Which one is the truth? And if that was the case, what about my real world? What happened to it? Could I even go back? No. Does it even matter? From the start, my goal was simple. Go back to my brother. Even after almost an entire year in this strange world, my goal hadn't changed. Gods and unrecorded. I carefully mused over the words. I needed to find out more about them. There was little known about them, but all the clues and pieces hint toward their involvement. In order for me to get to the bottom of this, I needed to find out more about them. Thankfully, I wasn't completely lost in this regard. There were the 7 main churches and the diary that once belonged to the Emperor of Nothing. I had yet to move past the first page. With everything that had been going on, I hardly had the time to sort through the diary. The hardest part was sorting through the handwriting, which was somewhat difficult to read. Rumble. Shaking me out of my thoughts was another rumble. This time, the sensation seemed to come from directly beneath my feet. Before I could even process what was happening, a large chunk of the ground cracked and split apart. I nearly lost my balance as I felt a force pushing up from below. It lifted me off the ground and moved up, almost like an elevator. Seeing the ground shrink before my very eyes, the lock that sealed my emotions shattered, and I stumbled a couple of steps. What's going on? Ducking down, I pressed my hand against the makeshift platform to steady myself. Looking around in confusion, I saw several other platforms emerging from the ground. Thick chains beneath each platform were slowly lifting them into the air. Several participants appeared on each platform. I was the only one on my platform. It was strange since there were also people beneath, looking up in our direction in confusion. As I was wondering what was going on, a figure flashed right next to me. He was dressed in dark robes that clung to his body. With blonde hair, faintly graying at the sides, and thin brows, he stood by the edge of the platform. A faint and oppressive aura lingered over his body as he stood in silence. But that silence didn't last for long. His lips parted open shortly after as he announced, Julian Ivinus of the Nuz and Sifa Empire versus Carmen Rivaline of the Etheria Empire. My expression shifted as I noticed figures flickering in and out on each platform around me. The ground beneath the platforms began to restore itself once more, while several small floating objects orbited around our general area. You have 5 minutes to get prepared. Carmen Rivaline stood tall at 1.90 meters, towering over most participants and gathering their attention with his intimidating presence. His brown hair, blue eyes, and well-proportioned features made him objectively handsome, drawing the gazes of those around him. Out of nowhere, several platforms emerged from the ground, thrust upward by thick chains adorned with strange purple runes. These platforms ascended and settled in the sky, suspended high above the plaza. They sure didn't skim on the visuals. With a smirk, Carmen crossed his arms and looked at the platform as well as the statue that was surrounded by the platforms. It was an intimidating sight. Julian Ivinus of the Nuz and Sifa Empire versus Carmen Rivaline of the Etheria Empire. Hearing his name called out, he instinctively looked up, scanning the platforms with a calm look. Shortly after, a small cube appeared before him. He knew that he'd be transported to the platform the moment he pressed it. Carmen was just about to do so when a hand pressed against his shoulder. Wait a second. A calm and smooth voice followed suit. Carmen felt a chill run down his spine as the voice reached his ears. Every hair on his body stood on end as he slowly turned his head, locking eyes with 2 deep yellow orbs that glowed with an intensity rivaling the white sun above. The unsettling calm smile on Caius's face only heightened the tension, making his body grow stiff. What do you need me to do? It's nothing big. Caius slowly looked up, fixing his gaze on a certain platform. Your opponent is an emotive mage. Be careful when fighting him. Try applying the technique you've used on me when sparring. Ah yes, the number of people that could rival Caius in his age group was almost non-existent. Carmen had once had the ambition of beating him but ultimately failed. And it wasn't even close. In order to defeat Caius, who was proficient in emotive magic, he developed mental techniques to combat it. But even then, it was useless. He was unable to defeat Caius. That monster. Test the limit of his emotive magic. If you can block it, then test the limit of his curse magic. It's okay even if you lose. Caius peacefully patted his shoulder. What matters is that you let me see better. Top of form. He quietly left right after that, leaving Carmen standing by himself with a blank expression. It took a moment for Carmen to snap out of it, his face slowly contorting in the process. Extending his hand, he grasped the cube that materialized before him. As his fingers tightened around it, his vision blurred and then refocused. He found himself standing on top of the platform. His eyes immediately set on the figure that stood in front of him. He was shorter than Carmen, appearing almost tiny in comparison. His black hair was neatly combed to the side, and he wore a black suit typical of those from the Nuz and Sifa Empire. His hazel eyes were calm, like a still, rippleless well. Standing before him, Carmen's expression cooled. It's okay even if you lose. Caius's words once again echoed in his ears. Does he think there's a chance I'd lose? Clench. His teeth tightened as he looked at his opponent. He felt his blood boil as the two stood in silence on opposite ends. Carmen was well aware of his opponent. Ranked in the 30s, he was someone that he needed to keep an eye on. In particular, he was a strong emotive mage according to the reports. But Carmen wasn't afraid of emotive mages. In fact, he thrived against them. He refused to believe there was anyone on Caius's level when it came to emotive magic. It was for that reason that he felt his blood boil. I may not be able to defeat Caius, but that doesn't mean I can't defeat an inferior version of him. Focusing on the referee, Carmen tensed his entire body and assumed a ready stance. As he closed his eyes, an enormous snowy mountain appeared in his mind, towering majestically and reaching toward the clouds. Rumble. The mountain rumbled faintly, sending a subtle tremor through the snow-covered peak. Despite the distant rumbling, Carmen remained composed, holding the visualization steady in his mind. And then, begin. The moment the referee's voice echoed across the platform, everything came crashing down as a massive avalanche formed. With a fierce expression, he leaned into his shoulder and charged toward Julian, the platform cracking under the force of each step. Crack, crack. At the same time, another image appeared in his mind. As he charged forward, another image surfaced in his mind. A calm lake, its surface nearly still, reflecting the moon that hung serenely in the sky. evoking a deep sense of peace. It was a stark contrast to the crumbling mountain. And as he raised his head, Carmen's eyes locked onto Julian's. "Come!" he shouted in his mind, his lips curling into a smile. "Try using your emotive magic." Chapter 307. First Opponent 2. Begin. As the referee's voice faded, Julian raised his head and adjusted his physical and mental condition. He didn't make any significant movements and remained standing in the same spot. At the same time, Carmen's leg muscles bulged and wiggled as though they were alive, tensing and twisting before releasing all the tension at once and speeding up in Julian's direction. With a quick burst, he appeared right before Julian, and he lowered his body further down. CRA crack. Carmen's steps were so heavy that he left deep imprints on the ground behind, fine miniature cracks spreading from the area of compression. Whoop! With a loud shout, his legs tensed further as he lowered his stance, readying himself for a shoulder tackle aimed at Julian. Every detail was meticulously aligned: the speed, the precision, and the awkward angle of the attack. Everything was as he envisioned in his mind. Anyone else in Julian's position would have likely been flustered by the situation, but he remained calm and composed. Tack. With a light step forward, Julian raised his hand, effortlessly pressing it against the incoming shoulder. Although his movements appeared slow to Carmen's eyes, they were deceptively fast, and his hand soon made contact with Carmen's shoulder. Carmi immediately became confused by his action. Was he thinking of blocking his attack with his hand? But he soon understood. Yuk! Abruptly, Carmen felt his shoulder become incredibly heavy, pulling it downward and throwing his center of gravity off balance. Bang, bang, bang. Carrying the momentum, Carmen stumbled past Julian, his feet digging deep into the ground as he struggled to regain his balance. But how could Julian give him a chance? Without even glancing at his opponent, he raised his right hand as threads materialized, positioning themselves in Carmen's path. With no time to evade, Carmen's eyes locked onto the approaching threads, his expression hardening. His thigh muscles tensed as he twisted his torso, raising one leg high. In a desperate move, he slammed his foot down behind him, the ground cracking under the force of his stomp. Bang! Carmen's body skidded back a few centimeters, dangerously close to the threads. A flicker of alarm crossed his mind, but he quickly steeled himself, clenching his teeth as veins bulged along his neck. Ark! He pressed harder against the ground, forcing more power into his thighs, determined to stop his body. He was eventually able to come to a stop. Only then did he sigh in relief. That was close. He looked at the threads behind him and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Taking another deep breath, he shifted his attention back toward Julian. Crack. Fissures spread from the ground beneath Carmen's feet, forming a web of cracks across the platform. With his incredible stamina, he barely paused before launching himself forward again. His muscles twisted and tensed, coiling like springs as they gathered immense energy for the next charge. He arrived before Julian in a matter of seconds. Again, Carmen repeated the same pattern as his first attack. Twisting his back and waist, he threw a punch in his direction. Ah! The air twisted around his fist, producing a faint whistling sound. Julian, who had just fended off Carmen's initial attack, was momentarily taken aback by how quickly Carmen could recover and gather his energy. What surprised him even more was the sheer force behind each of Carmen's attacks, which erupted with the intensity of a volcano, holding onto tremendous power. A single hit would mark the end of the fight. Bang! Julian repeated his previous action, positioning his hand against Carmen's incoming punch and applying step of suppression over it. Just as Julian thought Carmen would stumble forward, Carmen planted his foot firmly against the ground and threw another punch in his direction. What the? Faced with this sudden change, Julian had no choice but to intercept the attack once more, pressing his hand against Carmen's fist and barely suppressing it. Bang! Julian then kicked him directly in the chest, distancing the two of them from each other. Endless stamina, and a tremendous burst of strength. Carmen came yet again. Swoosh! Julian started to feel the pressure of the fight. Despite his body growing stronger and now being tier 4, he didn't think about taking on the fist heathen. That would simply be suicide. Instead, he opted for the same trick as before. Taking a step back, he raised his hand and tried to press it in the fist's direction. Unexpectedly, Carmen saw through the action and swiftly adjusted his strategy. He pressed his left foot forward, twisting his heel, which altered the trajectory of his punch just as it was about to make contact with Julian's hand. The immense strain on his bones was evident, creaking under the pressure, but Carmen pushed through the pain. Pity. At the last moment, he just managed to move his hand and block his attack. Julian had come dangerously close to losing. Carmen was satisfied with this result as he grinned. Things will be a lot easier for me now. He still didn't quite understand the mechanics of the weird gravitational technique, But he understood something. He needs a little time to adjust the position. Most likely, the reason why he uses his hand is to help him set the position. In that case, things were easy now. Crack. The ground split apart yet again as Carmen's body thundered forward. His right arm shook as the fixed his gaze on Julian's weakened side. He didn't waste a second and pretended to throw a feint in that direction. As expected, Julian's eyes trembled as he hesitated. Activate skill or not? Carmen smiled. Swoosh. He took advantage of Julian's slight hesitation to attack in that direction. Got you. Clank. Ah! Carmen's expression changed as he felt his fist hit something hard. Lowering his head, he was shocked to see a thick chain appear around Julian's torso. It directly acted as a shield as it absorbed most of the impact. Nonetheless, Julian still stumbled back due to the rebound force of the attack. Nah. Carmen's breathing was extremely heavy. Looking in Julian's direction, his expression crumbled. He blocked it. This was problematic. It made almost all of his actions until this point useless. Clench. Just as he thought he had managed to find a breakthrough, his opponent found a new way to defend. It was as though he was facing a massive fortress. Tall and impenetrable. It was frustrating. No, I've got to stay calm. Carmen was an experienced fighter and thus was able to quickly recompose himself. He started to think about all the possible things he could do. I'm starting to become exhausted. At this rate, hell win. I need to find a way to bait his emotive magic. So long as Julian used his emotive magic, Carmen was confident in winning. For some reason, since the start of the match, Julian had not once used his emotive magic. Right, I just need to bait his emotive magic out. Nay, you want to bait my emotive magic, don't you? A cold voice suddenly reached him from the front, and Carmen felt his entire body shudder as his head flicked up in shock. How did he know? Massaging his arms, Julian met his gaze and his lips gently pulled up. Do you think I'm stupid? His voice was quiet, yet he managed to reach Carmen's ears smoothly. You've got a pretty talented emotive mage from your empire. It would be weird if you didn't have countermeasures against emotive magic. I can tell with a glance that you want me to use emotive magic. Carmen came to a sudden realization as his eyes widened. But before he could open his mouth to say anything else, Julian spoke again. But to be honest, even if you did have countermeasures, they'd be useless. He suddenly brought his hand forward in a snapping motion. Before Carmen could figure out what was going on, he heard a low snap and his mind grew blank. Something flooded his mind, overflowing his consciousness like a tsunami. His face grew pale, his eyes lost focus, his entire body started to tremble, and his breathing stopped. It all happened so suddenly that the referee didn't even notice a change before Julian thrust his body forward and arrived right before Carmen. Throwing an undercut, his fist directly landed against Carmen's stomach. Thump. Falling face flat against the ground, Carmen remained motionless as the referee's voice echoed out. Match over. Julian Ivinus of the Nuz and Sifa Empire wins. Chapter 308. Red Orbit. With a total of 48 participants, there were 24 matches on full display for the entire world to see. Because all of the matches happened at the same time, the broadcast only displayed a few of the more high-profile matches. Those included Aoife from the Nuz and Sifa Empire, the Empire's princess and highest-ranked member from the Empire, Caius from the Etheria Empire, Amel from the Verdant Empire, and Kalian from the Aurora Empire. These were the 4 highest profiles from each empire, and were known as the Big Four. For that reason, the broadcast was fully focused on them. They all ended in victory. None of their matches lasted longer than a minute with each and one of them ending the fight rather fast. Because of how fast their match ended, the other participants had time to be displayed in the broadcast. Leon Ellert from the Nuz and Sifa is also a participant to deeply watch out for outside of the Big Four. Some might even argue he's stronger than Aoife, but there's not much information that we can dig through. Each empire has kept a level of secrecy for its participants. We will see by the end of the summit if the rankings were correct or not. Carl Geneva, the broadcaster, had a husky yet smooth voice that was exceptionally pleasing to the ears, perfect for such a broadcast. With neatly combed hair, sharp features, and dressed in a well-fitted suit, he looked every bit the professional. Alongside him was a well-dressed woman with black hair arranged in a bun, sharp brows, and plump lips. Her sharp features gave her a heroic and imposing appearance. Johanna Mebson, a Tier 7 knight. She was specifically invited for her exceptional strength, allowing her to see and analyze things that Carl might miss. That's great. With you here, things will definitely be exciting. Carl laughed lightly while pressing down and changing the broadcast away from Leon, who had just won his match. Unlike the others, his match lasted a little bit longer. He fought against a higher-ranked opponent from the Etheria Empire, which was why it took him a bit longer. Nonetheless, his match was still considered fast. As he changed the broadcast, Carl lightly chuckled. That was because he noticed that the next match had also ended. Johanna answered in a flat tone. She had a serious demeanor and found it hard to joke around. The audience liked the sharp contrast between the two presenters. Though Carl tried to look surprised, he already knew all the information. He was merely putting on an act for the audience that was watching the broadcast. Oh, that's really interesting. The first phase was quite unique, wasn't it? The participants were transported all around the mirror dimension. Because the audience hadn't been filled about what had happened during the first phase due to it not being broadcast, it was Carl's job to do so. He did so in a smooth and fluid manner that made it easy for the audience to understand. Johanna nodded quietly alongside him. She then pointed at the screen. But don't be fooled by the result of the first phase. Arriving first doesn't mean that you're the strongest. To some extent, it shows off your strength, but it can also be a display of luck. It all depends on what type of monsters you face. If you end up dropping in a zone filled with, let's say, wraiths, then it'll be considered bad luck. Carl showed a look of understanding. Johanna nodded before pressing down and changing the broadcast. While there are cases like that, the order of arrival is a good indicator of one's strength. Take a look at this match. Johanna pointed at the new match that was displayed on the screen. It was a fierce match that shook the entire platform. Bang! Cracks formed with each step the participants took, displaying just how fierce the entire conflict was. However, if one paid close attention, they'd notice that one side was defending while the other was attacking. In this case, the attacking side looked to be suppressing his opponent. He was also starting to open up more and more openings. Johanna glanced at the sheet beside her. It displayed the results of the first phase. Carmen ranked quite a bit higher than Julian, who was ranked amongst the last people during the first phase. The difference is showing in this match. The name rang a bell and Carl's eyes lit up. Johanna answered for him. He's one of the top prospects in the competition. He's ranked amongst the 30s and was the previous Black Star of Haven. Oh, the previous Black Star. Correct. However, from my sources, it appears that he suffered a serious injury and was forced to give away his position. Had he not been injured, he'd have ranked higher. He's a talented prospect who specializes in emotive magic. Carl looked back at the match. Indeed, Julian was currently getting suppressed by his opponent, who was launching relentless attacks in his direction. Each time, he'd display a new set of movements and techniques that even Johanna had no choice but to praise. His control over his body is extremely refined. To be able to control his body to such a degree, he has the makings of an exceptional knight. From the way he twisted his body mid-motion, to how he was also able to alter the course of his fist. Johanna, as a Tier 7 knight, could do nothing but show praise for him. Carmen is slowly taking control of the fight. He seems to have Julian's gravitational skill figured out. Johanna went on to explain as Carmen's body twisted and the back of his fist launched and directly aimed for the startled Julian. The audience watching looked at the scene with bated breaths. It was an incredibly tense fight, and those from the Etheria Empire cheered loudly as Carmen started to take control of the fight. As they cheered, Johanna's cold voice continued to echo through the speakers. This is also mainly Julian's fault. By repeating the same pattern, he allowed Carmen to get a better idea of how his skill works and helped him figure out how to proceed. Johanna lightly sighed. Carl looked at her for a brief moment before asking, I was just thinking about how Julian could use his emotive magic to turn things around until I remembered that Carmen is from the same empire as Caius. It's highly likely that he's waiting for Julian to use his emotive magic. Carl came to the realization as he smacked his hand against the table. This is dangerous. Is there a way things can turn around for Julian? Johanna answered calmly, pointing in Carmen's direction. Or more specifically, his heavy breaths. With an exaggerated expression, Carl zoomed in on Carmen's features. Indeed, he was panting heavily. They had all been so mesmerized by his control over his body that they had forgotten just how straining such actions were. Carl clapped his hands in delight. A sudden shift occurred in the middle of Carl's speech. Out of nowhere, Carmen's body underwent a subtle shift. His body trembled, and his face turned pale. He froze for several seconds, unable to move. Julian seized the opportunity, springing forward and launching a swift attack directly into Carmen's stomach. The expression of those from the Etheria Empire grew pale and silence reigned over. Thump. Carmen's body fell shortly after that, marking the end of the match. Carl stood excitedly as he looked at Johanna. Aha. Indeed, you were right. He lost due to his exhaustion. What a terrific match. If only he had a little bit more stamina, then he'd have won the match. He seemed very excited about the entire thing. The audience was too. Some sighed in disappointment while others were excited. There were also a few who shook their heads. It was a good match. As always, it's such an honor to have the insights of an expert like you. I would have never have picked it up. While the result of the match sunk in, Johanna's expression remained firm. She replayed the last moments of the fight before frowning. Did Carmen really lose due to exhaustion? That hurt. As soon as the match ended, a glowing cube materialized before my eyes. I reached out and grasped it, and in that instant, my surroundings shifted. I found myself back in the main plaza, standing beneath one of the shadows cast by the platforms above. There were already several people waiting beneath. They sure were fast. None of them seemed to be in the mood for talking, sitting down with their eyes closed and trying their best to recuperate their energies. Nobody knew when the next match would start, so it made sense. Another thing that I noticed when sitting down was how the number of people present was a lot lower than before. Almost half of us got eliminated. There were still some that were competing, so it wasn't for certain. I sighed for a moment and sat down. Rubbing my arm, my face twitched. It still hurts. The fight had been pretty hard. There were many ways that I could have finished the fight, and I was confident in defeating him, but one thing became clear to me. With my current strength, I might not win this. My opponent, as far as I knew, lagged quite a lot in strength compared to their top-ranked prospect. While I did win, I didn't think I was a whole gap stronger than him. I was stronger, but not to the extent where I could completely disregard him. I was confident in my emotive magic, but everyone was probably prepared for it. Not just for me, but for the number 1 ranked prospect. He was also an emotive mage. I needed to be careful about displaying the extent of my emotive magic. No, even if I do that, I don't think it's enough. I needed more. Something that would truly push my strength to the next level. But what? Clench. What can I do? Chapter 309. Red Orb. 2. The thought of my strength not being enough started to set in my mind. While the event was important, what was most important was the reward that came with ranking first. The Empire had yet to reveal the reward, but everyone understood it was going to be extremely important. It could range from a very powerful relic, manual, or bone, to even information that I wanted to know. I could use the chance to learn more about the unrecorded. But that's probably not a very good idea. While I didn't know the full details, I knew that the Empire was closely tied with one of the unrecorded. The vision I had experienced regarding Atlas being my greatest piece of evidence. If I was so blatant with my request to know about the unrecorded, then I'd immediately turn eyes in my direction. Oh wait, I had a sudden realization. Aren't I currently being chased by an unrecorded? The faceless man? No. In the first place, was I being chased by him? I wasn't so sure if I had to be honest. Thinking back to Atlas, he was so powerful. For such a figure to be a mere subordinate, how much more powerful was the faceless man? Would he really struggle to look for someone like me? Perhaps it was a subordinate of his that was chasing me. Maybe there are some drawbacks that I'm not aware of that are preventing him from finding me directly? I doubted that such a powerful figure would struggle to find someone like me if they had the chance. He was either preoccupied with something or had some sort of limitation that prevented him from reaching me. I'm more inclined to believe it's the latter. Still, if there was someone who would know best about my brother, then it had to be him. One way or another, I needed to figure out a way to meet him. But not yet. As things stood, I was in no position to ask him anything. Trading the sword in exchange? As if he wanted to, he'd just be able to snatch the sword from me. He had no need to trade with me. And even if he did trade, that would only show to me how important the sword was to him. I still didn't know much about the sword. I couldn't just carelessly give it away without knowing what the consequences of giving it away were. Ha! What a troublesome situation. After a little bit of thought, I decided to leave things be for now. I was growing stronger, but it was still not enough. I needed more time to grow further. For now, I need to focus on the tournament. At the end of the day, it all boiled down to the fact that I was still weak. I needed to become stronger, and winning the tournament was the key in order to gain the resources that would help me achieve such strength. But there was one problem with the entire situation. I'm still not strong enough to deal with the top contenders. The gap wasn't wide, but it was there. My current level was around that of Leon's or perhaps lower. It was hard to tell since we had never fought ever since that time. My emotive magic was on another level compared to that time, but I had neglected everything else in the process. And this was a problem. How can I bridge the gap between us? The gap between me and the top contenders? I thought long and hard about the question, to the point where I started to run all sorts of different ideas and simulations. But in the end, the only answer I could come up with was also the one that I thought was the hardest and least likely to happen. That was, create a concept for my future domain. Asterisk. Intent, concept, materialization. A domain's creation was based on these 3 different factors. The hardest part of creating a domain wasn't actually materialization, nor was it the creation of a concept. It was in fact, intent. From my research of it, finding an intent was something that was akin to enlightenment. It just came to you when you least expected it. You couldn't really look for it. It was for this reason that many people found it hard to move past the fourth tier. Finding an intent was not something that anyone could do. But I did. I probably won't be able to materialize my domain until way later, but I don't need a full domain. Just a little bit. One didn't need to reach the materialization stage to use a domain. They could do so at the concept stage, but the effects would be a lot milder and there was a massive drawback to it. If the concept shattered due to an external force or overuse of it, then the intent would shatter, leaving a person with no intent. That would almost be the same as being crippled. Unless they found another intent, they would be as good as stuck in the fourth tier. It's risky, so I'm not sure. The thought was tempting, but I wasn't too confident. But what other choice did I have? If I really wanted to be on par with the others, then this was my only choice. Let's try for now. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. Regardless of whether I wanted to do this or not, I still needed to create a concept. But how could I go about this? A concept was an idea or law that would shape the domain. How did I want the laws of my domain to be? Curse dominant? Emotive dominant? Or something else entirely? This is difficult. I felt sweat accumulate on my forehead as I thought long and hard about how to create a concept. I needed to be firm about my decision since once the concept was fully formed it couldn't be changed. My entire vision was dark. I drowned out all the noise around me and focused on the darkness around me. This was the current state of my domain. An empty darkness with no laws or visualizations. Extending my hand, a flame appeared, dancing at the top of my palm and brightening the darkness that surrounded me. It was only for a brief moment as I closed my hand and the flame disappeared. It works. In the realm of my imagination, I could create or make anything that I wanted. The same was true for a domain. Within my domain, I could create things that my body wasn't capable of doing. One such thing was the creation of fire. While it was possible for me to practice fire spells and evoke them, there were certain limits. The limits of my body. But in a domain? Crackle. A fire appeared in the distant darkness. Crackled lightly at first, but with time it started to expand. It grew more and more prominent, and within a few seconds, the entire space was covered in raging flames that seemed to want to engulf me in their entirety. In my domain, I basked in the sea of flames. I was a man of fire. Swoosh. I waved my hand and got rid of the flames. H.A. Opening my eyes, light returned to my vision as I breathed heavily and sweat covered my entire body. I felt completely drained of energy and could hardly make a sound. Despite everything having happened in my mind, I found myself struggling for breaths. There wasn't actually anything wrong with my stamina. In fact, it was perfect. The same was true for my mana. It was almost full. The thing that was completely drained was my mental energy. Conceptualization came from the mind and I exhausted everything in order to make the entire world rage with flame. I swallowed my saliva and looked at the platforms above before clenching my teeth. I need to hurry up. Looks like the first bouts of fights are coming to an end. Supporting his cheek with a propped-up hand, Theron's eyes scanned the platforms below. Intense combat bouts had just taken place, with the final combatants wrapping up their matches as he spoke. Overall, the results were as he expected. In the end, it doesn't matter how many contestants your empire has. What matters is that they reach the end. Theron's gaze shifted toward Lucian and Gale. They were the ones who had lost the most participants during the first bout. While neither showed much of a reaction, Theron could notice the visible annoyance in Lucian's eyes as his thick brows knitted slightly. Theron felt the corner of his lips curl at the sight. I did expect some losses from your empire, but as much as half of them? A little shocking, honestly. Their members gave almost laughable performances. He didn't say much about the ones from the Naz and Sifa Empire since it had always been like this. But from the Aurora Empire? This was the first time he had ever seen such a horrible batch. A thought suddenly crossed his mind. Right, I did hear that an incident occurred right before the start of the summit. I never got to hear the details, but it can't be the reason for why you're performing so bad. Is it? Neither Gale nor Lucian made a sound, but seeing the look on Gale's face, he understood that he had hit the mark with his question. So something really did happen. He wasn't really sure since he had never been briefed about it, nor did he care. However, things were different now. Thinking back to the fights, he did see that those from the Aurora and the Zansifa Empire were somewhat timid at certain points in their fights. They still displayed a decent level of skills, but not to the standards that they were capable of. Something was clearly holding them back, but he just wasn't too sure what it was. Only the two of them knew. Interesting. Whatever the case was, he could tell that the mentalities of the participants were somewhat off. Some were better at hiding it than others, and some had managed to resist up until this point, but he could see a subtle shift occurring. He could sense that a few were a fine line from succumbing to whatever demons were haunting their mind. Theron could see that Lucian and Gale knew about what he had noticed. It was just that they remained silent about it. The smile on his face grew as his face leaned more on his hand. How long will they last before blowing up? His eyes fell on a girl with long platinum hair and red eyes. Without a doubt, she was definitely the one who was suffering the most. Chapter 310. Red Orb 3. Kira sat with her eyes closed. She had also fought like the others, and her fight lasted for about a minute and a half. Her speed could be considered neither too fast nor too slow. It was in the upper regions as she swiftly dealt with her opponent. Kira's brows twitched. A sharp pain invaded her mind for a brief moment before disappearing. It was brief but noticeable enough for her to perceive. She opened her eyes shortly after and looked around her. There were a total of 7 people remaining from their group. It was clear that they had lost half of their members in the first round. She didn't show much emotion and focused her attention on Aoife, who was scrolling through a small tablet. As if noticing her stare, Aoife turned her head. Their eyes met. "Are you healed? More or less?" Kira replied after a short pause. Normally she'd have answered with a "What? What are you looking at? Look away." But she seemed strangely calm today. Took Aoife aback a little. Caught off guard by the normal response, Aoife found herself at a loss for words for a few seconds. Took her a good minute to snap out of it. Here. Since Kira was being so mild today, she didn't mind sharing what she had. In fact, this was supposed to be something that she meant to share with everyone. It was just that they were all still recuperating their energies. "What's this?" Kira grabbed the tablet and looked at it. That was when she finally saw the numerous clips and replays that were on it. Aoife scooched a little before whispering, "It's a clip of all the fights that just happened. Take a look at them and memorize how they fight, since our next match will start in a bit. It'll help us get ready for the next fights." "Oh." Kira looked through the fights with a disinterested look. Then, after skimming through a few clips, she passed the tablet back to Aoife. "Here. That's it?" "Yes. Is there something wrong? You've been acting a little odd. Are you perhaps SI? I'm not. Then, there's no point in looking at the fights. Those that are worth fighting held back, while the ones who went all out aren't worth my time. Don't bother as well. It's a waste of time." Kira began to close her eyes under Aoife's dumbstruck expression. Her mouth, like that of a fish, opened and closed repeatedly as she tried to find her words. She really did try, but in the end, no word came out of her mouth. When she thought about it, she realized that Kira's words held some truth to them. Those that they needed to pay attention to most likely didn't reveal any of their cards, while those that they didn't need to pay attention to had revealed all their cards. But it still doesn't hurt to check. One couldn't be too careless after all. Aoife was just about to say this to her when she stopped. That was mainly because she received a notification, and her expression changed slightly as she looked at Kira. The pairings for the next bouts were announced. Her opponent was quite strong, but that wasn't what shocked her. No, what shocked her was someone else's pairing. Kira's. Platform 5. Kira Milne vs. Agatha Winters now. Etheria Empire Resting Area. It's interesting. Caius replayed the match between Julian and Carmen again. For each time he looked, he'd notice something new. In the end, he couldn't help but clap in fascination. Not bad at all. He was quite satisfied with what he had seen. It looks like he is using his hand in order to activate the weird gravitational skill, but it's actually not the hand that activates it. It's his. Caius's eyes lowered, pausing on Julian's feet. Julian had done a good job at hiding it, or perhaps never intended to hide it, but if one paid close attention, they'd notice how each time he activated the skill, he took a step in either direction, even though it was unnecessary. That made it quite obvious for Caius to discover the trick behind the skill. Julian also didn't have very great control over the skill. From there, he was able to come up with a conclusion. He's about the middle of the pack in terms of strength. Julian wasn't that strong, that much was obvious. However, Caius couldn't wait to see his emotive magic. It's a bit of a pity that he still hasn't used it yet. Julian hadn't fallen for the trap that Carmen had set up. It would have been quite entertaining had he done so, but sadly he didn't. In the end, Carmen ran out of stamina and the fight ended. There was a slight anomaly in the replay, but Caius dismissed it. The only way he could explain that irregularity was through the 4th phase of emotive magic, which was simply impossible for someone Julian's age to perform. In fact, there were hardly any emotive mages that could reach such a stage, let alone someone so young. Caius was believed to be the one to have the most potential to reach such a state. He didn't think for one second that there was someone out there with the ability to reach the 4th phase at such an age. It wasn't arrogance, but an impossibility. It was like having the ability to be near the zenith at such an age. It made no sense. "Young master." Angela stood by his side the entire time. With her usual cold expression, she didn't speak much and only waited for the right time to speak. Now was such time. Their pairings for the next round have been released. Oh, Caius looked at the tablet with his hand before his expression paused. Then, raising his head to look at Angela, he laughed. Now that, his eyes squinted. Isn't that fun? Platform 12. Julian Dacre Ivinus versus Angela Karliak. Another one from the Etheria Empire? I looked at my matchup and sighed. My energy was almost fully recovered, but my injuries weren't. I would have preferred it if I had been matched up with an easier opponent, but in the end, I was matched up with someone high up in the rankings. This will probably be more difficult than my first fight. Angela was a speed-type body user. Her first match was amongst the fastest, as she ended it just a little bit after the top 4 ended their matches. It was most likely done so on purpose in order to not take the spotlight from Caius. In any case, her strength was something that couldn't be dismissed, and in order for me to have any chance at beating her, then I had no choice but to take it extremely seriously. To make matters worse for me, it's highly likely that someone has figured out how step of suppression works from the replays. It wasn't that I was trying to hide it, but I also didn't want people to see its glaring weakness. That was, as long as I couldn't take a step, then I couldn't use the skill. Such was one of the flaws of the skill. But it's not like this weakness can't be used to my advantage. If people knew about its weakness, then it wasn't hard to predict what they'd do next. And if that was the case, then things were easy for me. After all, a predictable opponent was a good opponent. Who? I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. The time for the next match was unknown. For that reason, I needed to take advantage of the little time that I had in order to recuperate my strength and figure out ways how to deal with my opponent. And that was what I did. I kept focused on my condition and sorted through all sorts of scenarios. Time passed this way, and before I knew it, a familiar-looking cube appeared before me, marking the start of the second bout of fights. I still didn't know how many fights we'd have to perform in a day, but I hoped it wasn't more than 3. By then, everyone would be too exhausted to compete. Oh well. Taking a good look at the cube in front of me, I reached out for it and clenched my hand. My vision shifted, and I found myself standing in the middle of one of the platforms above. Standing opposite me was a cold gaze. She stood a little shorter than me, but her demeanor appeared ice cold. It almost felt as though she was a robot. In a way, she reminded me of Delilah, but an even more extreme version. And that was crazy to think about. Please get ready. The referee, a woman with short red hair, spoke. She wore a similar uniform to the other referees and looked in our direction without much regard. She was here to do her job and couldn't show much bias. I got into position and took a light breath. I've watched her clips over and over again, but it feels like it only made things a lot more confusing. Her match ended quickly, and all I saw was a quick burst of speed before she ended up winning the fight. In the case that she ended up going off on the same type of offense. Begin. The referee's voice came down, breaking me off my thoughts. In the instant that her voice fell, my opponent's figure blurred from vision. She was coming. My eyes shook as I took a step back. But that wasn't enough. At speeds that I couldn't describe in words, her figure appeared once more. With her body lowered, the only thing that I managed to catch a glimpse of was her cold and indifferent eyes as they locked onto me. With her left hand raised above her head, and holding onto a sharp dagger, she slashed down directly toward my face. All of this transpired in less than a second, and before I even had the time to react, her dagger reached me, slashing toward my neck. Swoosh. The attack was swift and precise, landing directly on my neck. I felt my entire body jerk as an imaginary pain entered my mind. It was sharp and it made me twitch. But the pain was only imaginary. As the dagger cleaved down on my neck, I looked at my blurring figure, disappearing as though it had never been there in the first place. I then looked down, toward her exposed back. That was when I raised my hand and pointed my finger toward her exposed neck. Let this be over with. Chapter 311. Red Orb. 4. I aimed directly for the back of her neck. I didn't hold back and went for the kill. With the referee in attendance, I didn't need to worry about my opponent's well-being. The referees knew exactly when to stop the situation, and when they didn't, then it was on them rather than me. I wasn't going to cry over their mistakes. Show. The thread shot menacingly in the direction of her neck. The distance between her and my hand wasn't far, and with the speed of the thread, I didn't think she'd be able to react. But I was wrong. As if she had eyes at the back of her head, instead of blocking the attack, she ducked her head lower and masterfully dodged the attack. TSSS. A small hole formed on the spot where she had been. The speed at which she moved her neck was so fast that I hardly had time to process the situation. Her figure blurred, and I felt a gust of wind heading toward my right. I thought about punching in that direction, but decided against it and punched toward my left. Bang! Uck! I felt my fist connect with something sharp as I took a couple of steps back and looked at my fist. Drip! As expected, blood leaked down from my fist as I looked up to see my opponent gathering her steps as she stabilized her body. Evidently, she too had been pushed back. But she was quick to regain her bearings before she yet again disappeared from my sight. Instead of panicking, I kept my mind cool and extended my hand. Threads burst out, enveloping the area around me in all sorts of ways. This should slow her down a bit. At the same time, I pressed my foot against the ground and activated Step of Suppression. The entire area around me was now covered in threads. Not only that, but the gravitational force around me was also heavy. I surveyed my surroundings calmly. With this setup, I was confident in stopping her from reaching me. At least for the first few minutes. Rustle. My thought process was shattered by the rustling sound of clothes. They came from just next to me, and I felt my eyes widen slightly as a figure appeared right in front of me. With her body hunched slightly, she thrust the sharp dagger in my direction. I hardly had the time to react. Clank. A set of chains appeared at the last moment, moving toward my chest and blocking all the most important areas. The dagger's course changed right after that as I felt something sharp stab at both of my thighs. PFTTT. The pain registered rather quickly in my mind. It was sharp and electric. My thoughts squirmed as I found myself unable to move at all. Despite the pain, I knew that I couldn't be distracted. Focusing elsewhere but my thighs, I looked in my opponent's direction and closed my hands, gathering all the threads that were scattered throughout and forming an impenetrable net. This was the second trap that I had laid out. In the rare chance that she did manage to get through to my defenses, I planned on creating this net to trap her inside it. I looked into her eyes in hopes of seeing some sort of reaction from her, but she remained relatively calm. No, rather than calm, it was more that she was indifferent to the situation. My brows knit at the calmness that she displayed but still nonetheless closed the net. That was when her figure blurred. Before I even had the time to think, the net closed in on the surrounding area. But she was nowhere in sight. Raising my head up, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. With 2 daggers in her hands, she stood and stared at me with a cold look. I felt my mind shake at the sight. Teleportation? The broadcast was closely following the fights that were happening in the second round of fights. Unfortunately, because there were so many matches happening at once, they could only follow one at a time. It would only be until the round of 16 that the matches would be arranged at different times. The first 2 rounds were more to test the performers' endurance and stamina. The goal was to make them compete in situations where they weren't in top shape. Carl announced, pulling over the screen where Aoife appeared to be. Her match lasted a little longer than her previous one, but she still was able to get rid of her opponent rather quickly. The same was true for the 3 other Big Four. Johanna made her comment. Carl looked at Johanna meaningfully. That was when she answered. Carl laughed. As many of you are aware, Caius's talent lies in the mind category. He is talented in both emotive and telekinesis, which makes him a rare pure mind user. So far he has yet to use his emotive magic and has been able to dispatch his opponents in less than a few breaths. I wonder how strong he is if he uses his full power. While Carl laughed, Johanna sorted through the broadcasts before fixing her eyes on 2 profiles. She took a quick pick at them before picking one. Oh, are we going in for the next performance? Carl leaned forward and looked at the broadcast. His previous joyful expression froze at the sight that greeted him as he turned to look at Johanna, who was staring at the broadcast with furrowed brows. Displayed on the screen were 2 figures. On one side was an elegant woman with sharp features and cold eyes, while on the other was a bloodied figure who could hardly stand. He looked to be on his last leg. Carl pressed down and shifted his hand a little bit to the left. The broadcast paused and the images replayed back. Once he moved back a decent amount of time, he continued the broadcast, and it was there that he and the entire audience was able to see what had happened. Hiss! Carl drew a deep breath upon seeing the numerous threads that Julian had set up in order to stop Angela from approaching. He thought Angela would struggle to reach Julian, but he was shocked to see that not only was she able to get close to Julian, but she was also able to deal a heavy blow to him, attacking both of his legs. That was when Julian activated his trap. A net of threads appeared, closing in on Angela from all sides. It looked like there was nowhere for her to escape. But he was wrong. He was left utterly shocked by what he saw next as Angela appeared behind the net relatively unharmed in a matter of seconds. It looked as though she had teleported herself. Cutting him off, Johanna moved the video back and slowed it down by over 10 times. Carl held his breath and leaned forward to get a better look. He couldn't understand what she was trying to hint at, but he was curious. He watched in slow motion as Angela ran toward the threads that were obstructing her path with no regard. The scene shocked both him and the audience that was looking. Carl was about to voice out his thoughts when Johanna stopped him and continued to point at the screen. That was when Carl saw it. His eyes widened in shock. The same was true for some of the people watching the broadcast as some stood up in shock. This This is the first time that I've seen such skill. Carl turned to look at Johanna. Isn't this a little unfair? How can he even fight against this? Johanna kept her gaze on the replay. In there, Angela's body composition changed the outline of her gaseous figure, appearing for a split second, allowing her to pass through the threads and reach Julian. She then went on to speak. Her gaze fell on the struggling Julian who appeared on the screen, his entire body filled with cuts as he looked to be in a worse situation than before. Pursing her lips, Johanna spoke. I can see that. What do you think Julian's chances are? Johanna sighed slightly, fixing her gaze on the broadcast before her. PFTT. My head started to feel light as something stabbed against the right side of my torso. My lips twitched as I ignored the pain and took a deep breath. Who? I could only helplessly stand on the spot, staring at the cold figure that stood on the opposite end. Her dagger was now entirely covered in red while she looked completely fine. Clench. The sight made me clench my teeth as I struggled to properly understand what was happening. How is she able to dodge everything? It looked like she could teleport, but at the same time, I knew this wasn't the case. Although she was fast, there were times when I could follow her with my eyesight. She couldn't teleport, but she could pass through the threads and gravitational pull around me. I didn't know how she did it, but I knew that I had to figure this out fast. I was running out of time. But how? How was I going to do this? Rustle. A familiar rustling sound reached my ears. Following that, I ducked down and a hand appeared right above where my head used to be. I remained calm and dashed in the direction of where Angela was, in hopes of catching her. But it was useless. Ugh! Just when I thought I caught her, her figure blurred, disappearing from view. I didn't get angry or frustrated. There was no point in doing so and focused on numbing my emotions. How do I win this? I licked my lips. She was a pretty bad matchup for me. No, more than her being a bad matchup, it was almost as though she was built to completely destroy someone like me. I tried using emotive magic, but that proved futile as well. The moment I opened my mouth, she raised her hand and the sound around me stopped. It prevented me from using the vocalization aspect of my emotive magic. If I wanted to use emotive magic, then I had no choice but to touch her. But that was easier said than done. The more I fought with her, the more I realized just how much she was built to deal with someone like me. What should I do? I looked around me in hopes of finding some sort of answer, but nothing. I found myself unable to think of anything. I just stood in silence, unable to figure a way out of the situation. In such a desperate situation, rather than panicking, I became even calmer, abnormally calm, to the point where all the noise around me drowned out and I found myself standing in the middle of my sea of consciousness. In such a calm state, I was able to think clearly. With no distractive thoughts, I started to visualize an ideal, the faint trace of a concept. It was dark, but I could see something in the distance. It was faint but there. Rustle. A familiar rustle reached my ears, but I ignored it. I continued to stare in the distance, in hopes of seeing what was there in the distance. It grew closer, both the sound coming from outside my consciousness and the strange object in the distance. It soon came to my view, and my breath stopped. Glowing faintly, a red orb appeared. Chapter 312. Red Orb, 5. The orb pulsed before me. It throbbed like the beat of a heart. I stood motionless, staring at it with a blank mind. The world outside seemed to freeze. I knew this wasn't the case and the world was flowing at the same speed. It was just that my thoughts were running so fast that the world outside appeared to freeze. In the darkness, I stood before the orb. Throb, throb. With each throb, the orb grew brighter and brighter. The darkness that embraced it faded, replaced by a dim red glow. I stood in a trance, my eyes tracing over the orb that shrank and became the size of a football. The sight made my blood boil. Whew! I drew in a cold breath as I looked at my hands. As if I had some sort of X-ray vision, I was able to see the veins inside of my body. They throbbed in the same rhythm as the red orb that stood before me. Throb, throb. The speed at which the orb pulsed started to increase. It grew faster and faster and faster. And so did my veins. I felt my blood boil as something within me started to change. But I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. Just as I was wondering what was happening, a change occurred. The orb stopped pulsing for a brief moment. I stood blankly as I noticed the change and looked up. The orb appeared to be frozen in time, still like never before. That was until... throb. It suddenly throbbed again. However, unlike the other times, this was different. The sound reverberated throughout the entire space, almost making everything shake in the process. I stood still without losing my balance, and soon enough, a change occurred. A massive R fell from above and stopped beneath the red orb. I stood confused, unable to grasp what was happening. But even if I could have understood what was going on, I had no time to do so. A change yet again occurred to my body. The veins in my body throbbed with such intensity that I felt my entire body shake. My muscles twitched, and my hands started to shake. My body started to change. I could feel the fibers of my muscle tighten while my lungs widened. My perception of the world started to change right before my very eyes. I stood in silence while this was happening. No longer was I confused. All of this was something that I was willing through my imagination, and I soon understood what my subconscious was creating. I let it continue to do so. Throb. The orb throbbed again. This time, another letter appeared. Falling from the empty darkness from above. It stopped right next to the R. R-A. My body shook. I felt my teeth chatter as something started to boil in my abdomen. It was a faint swirl of energy that moved down every inch of my body, spreading down on all areas. Power started to surge through me. Clenching my fist, my energy surged even more. I couldn't quite control it, but I could feel it swirling inside of my body. If I were to punch at this moment, I'd be able to replicate the impact of what a body-type user would be capable of. Ha! With heavy breaths, I fixed my gaze on the orb as it stopped. The orb's surface began to writhe and squirm, as if something inside it was desperately trying to break free. The shape distorted, bulging in different areas. Instinctively, I reached out for it. I wasn't worried about my safety. This was all the fruit of my subconscious. My hand neared the orb, which started to distort and deform in all sorts of ways. My hand drew nearer, and soon, I came into contact with the orb. Throb. A new letter appeared right beneath the first two. G. Wum. The orb emitted a faint hum as its shape began to dissolve, transforming into a fluid-like form. It slithered toward my arm, silently reaching for every part of my body. Slowly, it crept over my skin, enveloping my arm completely in its cold, pulsating embrace. Power yet again surged through my entire body. It was even more than before. In my current state, it felt as though I could shatter everything in my fist. The orb continued to run down my body, covering every inch of it. My muscles squirmed and throbbed violently. They almost seemed to be rejecting the orb as it pushed them to a level that they had not once reached. My muscles bulged, the veins on my neck protruded, and my entire body started to overflow with energy. I felt extremely powerful, and as I raised my head, I fixed my gaze on the three-letter words that were floating before me. Rag. I knew exactly what the next letter was going to be, but before it could even materialize, the world stopped. Uck! My head throbbed violently. It was a familiar pain that made my entire body grow pale. The surroundings shook, and the viscous red liquid that was covering my entire body started to shrink back and move away from my body. As if time had reversed, the liquid returned to become the orb that throbbed in silence as the letters disappeared one after another. No. I reached out for the orb, but it was of no use. It simply refused to return to me as power started to drain out of my body. My head throbbed more fiercely as the A disappeared from my vision. What came after the A was the R, and it wasn't long before the only thing that was left was the orb. But even that disappeared shortly after. Light returned to my vision as I found myself back on the platform. Rustle. Something rustled in my ears. I quickly locked all of my emotions and silently endured the pain and weakness that overtook my body. With hardly any time to think, I decided to shift my head lightly. Swoosh. A dagger appeared, cutting right at my cheek as I felt something trickle down. I didn't need to look to know what it was. Meeting my gaze was a pair of cold eyes. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I reached out for her, but she disappeared before I could even catch her. She reappeared again on the opposite end. I felt suffocated while staring at her. She seemed to have a counter for everything that I did. It was frustrating, but the emotion didn't quite sink in. At least not in the state that I was in. I took a deep breath and tried my best to regain my stamina. In the meantime, I thought back to what just happened. I was close. It felt as though I was coming close to the creation of a concept. Though incomplete, a concept formed in my mind as I started to get a better idea of what my domain would be. What I had seen was merely one small part of it, but the idea was there. It was unfortunate that I wasn't able to grasp it at this very moment. It would have helped, but that would require an incredible amount of luck. I wasn't that lucky, and I didn't have time to try again. Staring directly in Angela's direction, our eyes locked for a brief moment before she disappeared. I immediately turned to my left despite hearing a rustling sound coming from my right. Swoosh. As expected, as though she were a ghost, Angela appeared on my left. I thrust my fist forward as she thrust her dagger forward. My fist and her dagger neared each other, and just as they were about to touch, Angela's hand twisted as the dagger shot for my heart. It all happened in a matter of half a second, and the dagger directly hit my chest. But there was no pain. Veil of deception. I looked at my body, which vanished, and then her exposed back. Like before, I pointed my right hand in the direction of her exposed neck. A familiar scene played out as she ducked down and avoided the thread. But that didn't matter to me as I raised my left hand. In the exact spot where she ducked down, a purple hand appeared. For the first time, a change occurred to her cold and indifferent features as she tried to avoid it. But it was too late. The hand gripped her face for a brief moment before shattering, her body disappearing shortly after that as she materialized at the far end of the platform. Ha! Ha! With heavy breaths, I stared in her direction. Her face was pale and her body was slightly trembling. It worked! For the first time since the fight had started, I had come out on top. Not only that, but I managed to get grip of pestilence to affect her. She was now cursed, and it would only be a matter of time before she lost all her energy. As if she realized this too, her gaze turned sharp. I stared back at her, evening out my heartbeat. I understood that her attacks were going to be even more relentless, but I was ready. Her figure blurred. Rustle. A rustling sound echoed behind me. I didn't fall for it and thrust my hand forward as it turned purple. Angela's figure appeared in front of my eyes. Her cold gaze stared at my purple hand before her hand blurred. I felt a series of sharp cuts appear all over my arm as my mind registered the pain. Before I could even counterattack, she disappeared, appearing right behind me where I felt a familiar set of cuts dig down on my back. I ignored the pain and twisted my torso to retaliate, but she disappeared before I could do so. Her figure appeared to my left, toward my exposed torso. As her dagger glided through the air and sliced it apart, it reached for my exposed area in an attempt to cut it. But before she could do so, a chain appeared. Clank, clank. It blocked all her attempts before coiling over her hand. As expected, you went for it. I didn't waste the chance. Tightening my left hand, the chain coiled out of my body and coiled around her hand tightly in an attempt to shatter her hand. I thought I had gotten her, but I was shocked to see the chain phase right through her body as her entire body turned gaseous. Clank, clank. The chain fell to the ground with a series of clanking sounds. Shifting my attention to her corporeal body, it finally dawned on me. The reason why she was able to get past all of my defenses and all of that. I smiled then. No wonder you made my life so hard. Chapter 313. Abnormality 1. A lot of things started to make sense in my mind. From how she was able to dodge all of my threads and how she dismissed step of suppression so effortlessly. It all boiled down to the fact that she was able to change the structure of her body, turning it into a gas. Masking her skill with her speed, she was able to hide the trick from my eyes. It took a bloodied body and several carefully laid traps to finally realize what her skill was. It's good that I know, but how do I handle this? My mind started to work in overdrive. Knowing how her skill functioned, I started to think of all possible ways to deal with it. It was unfortunate that she left me with no time to properly think. Russell. She arrived before me. There was no trick this time, and she directly confronted me head-on. I clenched my hand, and the threads that I had laid out moments prior closed in all around me, forming an inescapable net. She didn't seem bothered by it all as her gaze looked at me with a cold indifference. As expected, the threads phased right through her body. All of this happened in a split second, and as the threads phased right through her, she attacked me. She aimed her dagger directly at my heart. The dagger inched just a few centimeters away from my chest before stopping. Her eyes frosted as she twisted her torso and swung toward her back. Swoosh. Eh? A confused voice came out of her lips as nothing stood behind her. It wasn't an illusion. I smiled faintly and pressed my hand forward. Several threads shot out at once, all aimed at a different spot: leg, neck, back, pelvis, and shoulder. Unlike before, I didn't aim for just one spot. I wanted to seal all means of escape. And yet, as if she had eyes at the back of her head, her entire body started to twist and bend in an unnatural way, deftly avoiding all of the threads. Rolling on the ground, she pressed her hands down and pushed herself up. That was when she twisted her torso and she threw a dagger in my direction. Show. The dagger tore through the air. A whistling sound accompanied its movement. I had neither the time to think nor dodge. All I did was step back. The only thing I could do was watch as the dagger reached the top of my forehead, piercing the flesh. Tink. I felt a sharp pain at the top of my forehead as blood trickled down my face. It ran down my face, sliding down my cheeks as I lowered my head to stare at the dagger on the ground. That was close. My heartbeat was even and so was my breathing. To my right, I could see that the referee was tense, having almost interfered. It was a good thing that I was able to block her attack, focusing all my attention on the area around my head and increasing the gravity as much as possible. I was able to escape defeat by just a thin margin. Thud. Angela landed on the ground before pressing her feet hard and shooting toward me. I looked at her without much of an expression. She's getting slower. If before I couldn't see it, I could now see her. She was still fast, but not to the same level as before. The curse was taking effect. She seemed to have realized this as well as she grew more frantic with her attacks. With one dagger in her hand, she stepped forward and slid to my left side, bending down her body and slashing toward my torso. Her actions seemed calculated to the minute detail, leaving me breathless and suffocated. Not only was she fast, but she took no breaks in between each one of her attacks. Does she ever get tired? Despite my mind being filled with thoughts, my mind moved on its own. As if it was already aware of what she was planning, a thick chain materialized from out of nowhere, coiling around my body and covering the most vulnerable areas around my torso. This action left Angela with no other choice but to aim for a different area. That area was none other than my head as she lunged down and pressed hard against the ground, cracking the pavement beneath and shooting for my temple. Bang! I raised my left hand lightly and threads appeared from out of nowhere, surrounding her entirely and shooting for her. She didn't even bother looking at them as her eye fixed on my temple. Sure enough, her body started to change, turning more corporeal as the threads passed right through her body. The dagger had also turned gaseous, and it soon arrived right at my forehead. It was a mere inch away from it. In that split second when her body shifted back to her original form, my finger twitched. A purple hand appeared right before my face, phasing through the dagger and reaching out for Angela, whose eyes shook fiercely. I could tell that she was trying to revert her transformation back to gaseous, but it seemed impossible. In order to turn her body back into a gas form, her body needed to be back to normal. I understood this when testing her for the past several minutes, and took my chance right when she was changing between forms. I've got you. Unable to shift form and to move, I watched as the hand reached out for her face, dragging her head and forcing her to stumble several steps back. The dagger that had just been a mere inch away from my hand moved away as Angela scattered back, her face extremely pale and her body trembling. I knew this was much chance and didn't waste a second. Clenching my hands, threads appeared to surround the entire platform as they closed in on her from all directions. Despite her helpless situation, she tried to activate her skill, but it was too late. The threads reached for her, and just as they closed in on her, a figure appeared, forming a small dome around her. Match over. The voice quietly echoed through my surroundings as I stood on the spot. I could barely keep my balance as the noise around me faded into a distant murmur. Standing there, overwhelmed, I couldn't help but let out a small, almost delirious laugh. That was when I noticed something. Since the moment that my legs had been injured, I had hardly moved from the area I had been in. The winner is... I raised my head to look at the referee. Julian Ivinus of the Nuz and Sifa Empire Broadcasting Studio. The match had been followed very closely by Carl and Johanna. The same was true for the audience who watched the two combatants fight with bated breath. It was an incredibly intense battle that left many holding onto their seats. Even Carl and Johanna found themselves speaking less and less as the match progressed. In the end, a winner was announced. The studio was quiet for a short moment before Carl broke the silence. F-damn. He came dangerously close to swearing, but just in time managed to stop himself. But it couldn't be helped. The match had been that intense. He could even feel sweat form beneath his chair as he sat up a bit to adjust his pants. Johanna, on the other hand, seemed to be doing better. Her gaze was locked onto the broadcast as her eyes remained fixed on Julian, who was bloodied all over. Be it his face or body, it was covered in wounds. Carl began. With a chuckle, Carl turned to look at Johanna. What do you think? What are your opinions on the match? Please give us your expert opinion. Johanna didn't answer immediately. She sat in silence for a short few seconds, sorting through her thoughts. Eventually, replaying everything that had happened at the back of her mind, she started speaking. It was a difficult match, especially for Julian since Angela was an extremely bad matchup for him. Haha, we all saw that. Their matchup was indeed bad. Indeed. With her unique skill, Angela was able to turn the tides in her favor. Not only that, but if you noticed, Julian tried to use his emotive magic several times. Johanna played the broadcast back to display the times when Julian tried to speak. We can't hear what he's saying, but I can confirm that he was trying to use the vocalization aspect of his emotive magic. Right when he did that, notice how Angela moved her hand. I believe she countered his move through sound dissipation. Carl smacked his hand in realization. Haha, I guess she was prepared. After all, she does come from the same empire as that little monster. If you had to compare, who do you think is the better emotive mage between Julian and Caius? Johanna answered truthfully. Simply because of his status. He's from the royal family and has had a lot of resources since young. Compared to Julian, who comes from a barony, there's a huge difference. The two of them went on to talk like this for a few more minutes before they shifted their attention back to the main topic. Carl asked. Johanna answered truthfully. The injuries that Julian sustained during the fight aren't light, and he'll need to spend some time to recover. We don't know how much time he will have to recover, but even if he does recover, I don't see his chances being high. As if realization finally dawned on him, Carl's mouth hung open for a few seconds. When he found himself unable to muster any words, he bitterly smiled. Indeed, he was quite unlucky. With all the other participants having access to his replay, they'll find everything out about him. By the time they fight, he'll have it way harder than the rest. Carl sighed before shifting his attention back to the broadcasts. It was then that he noticed something from one of the platforms and his eyes soon widened. He pressed on the broadcast, which displayed two figures standing on opposite ends. The platform was shattered and broken all over. The two girls stood in silence, their eyes locked on each other, neither uttering a word as the tension between them hung heavy in the air. Carl's voice rang again. Chapter 3:14. Abnormality 2. Ha! I took a deep breath and suppressed the pain that was invading every inch of my body. A lot of the wounds that I had sustained were merely surface level, with Angela trying to bleed me out throughout the entire match. Her thoughts weren't wrong. I was just a few minutes away from losing too much blood to continue. I was thankfully able to turn things around in the nick of time. As the familiar cube materialized before me, I instinctively reached out and grasped it. Instantly, my surroundings blurred, and I found myself standing beneath the platform. There were several people already waiting beneath. "You don't look so great." Leon was one of them. Unlike me, he looked to be in tip-top shape. As his gaze wandered over my body, he tossed me a towel. "Here. Thanks." I wiped the blood and sweat that had accumulated all over my body. I then applied some ointments. My injuries were not too bad, and I could hold on to the pain, but I still needed to take care of them. I tossed the towel back once I was done. Plack. Leon never received the towel as it fell to the floor. The two of us stood in silence for a brief moment before looking at each other. I was the first one to speak. "Why did you?" "No, but that, I scratched the back of my head. We had some sort of miscommunication. Realizing what the problem was, I went ahead and picked up the towel before handing it over to him. He once again stood in silence. "You want it?" Leon's expression shifted slightly. "Why would I want it? Because it's yours?" I pointed at the name etched on the towel. "Leon Ellert." Leon shook his head. "Not anymore." "Then what do I do with this?" "Keep it." "But it has your name on it." "So? I don't like it." I tossed the towel to the side. Things would be a little weird if they saw me using a towel that had someone else's name on it. Heek. I had just thrown the towel when I heard a startled yelp. I felt my entire body tense, turning rigid like stone. Leon, frozen in place, seemed to experience the same sensation. In perfect sync, we turned our heads simultaneously. "What the hell?" Aoife yanked the dirty towel from her head, retching as she threw it to the ground. Her head snapped in our direction, eyes burning with unmistakable anger and rage. "Who?" She rose from the spot. It was the first time that I had ever seen her so angry. "Ha!" I sighed and looked at Leon. He looked back at me and shook his head. "No, don't. I've been meaning to tell you about this joke I've heard recently." Leon's face became rigid as his eyes turned bloodshot. I nodded at him and pointed at the name written on the towel. It was Leon. "Leon." Aoife's gaze, filled with malice, shifted toward him. He stood frozen, staring back at her with a helpless expression, unable to move. In that state, I could pretty much hear his inner thoughts. Should I tell her the truth? No, but if I do, he will say that? What is worse, Aoife, or that? The answer is obvious. But I didn't do anything wrong. I bit my lips and covered my mouth. The scene was so heart-wrenching. I just couldn't find it in me to look at him any longer and just turn my head. He is so pitiful. A sudden, startled sound jolted me back to reality. I turned my head and was surprised to see Aoife, her anger gone, clutching the broadcasting tablet in front of her with a calmer expression. Her expression was unusually serious. I inched closer to get a better look, and that was when I saw it. Kira's fight. I blinked my eyes for a short second before I heard Aoife's quiet voice echo around us. Since when was she this strong? Clank, clank. Agatha twirled her body lightly and slashed down with her sword several times. Each one of her movements was fluid and graceful, benefiting that of someone who was hailed as the next sword saint. On the other hand, Kira's fighting method was a lot wilder and unrestrained. With a forceful thrust of her hand, a spiral of flames erupted, roaring toward Agatha. Swoosh. In the broadcasting studio, Johanna paid close attention to the fight. It was a fierce fight that had been going on for the past 10 minutes with neither side taking advantage. This came as quite a shock since most believed Agatha to be stronger than Kira. And not by a small margin. Agatha was close to Amel in terms of strength. She was ranked as a top 5 to top 10 prospect, while Kira was placed in the top 50s. Both were undeniably talented, yet there should have been a significant gap in their abilities. And yet, clank, Agatha drove her sword into the ground, but the force still pushed her back several steps. Her icy blue eyes locked onto the blazing figure in the distance. Flames flickered in Kira's palm, and her ruby-red eyes gleamed menacingly. With a cold, unreadable expression, Kira flicked her finger, summoning several red magic circles around Agatha. Despite the number of attacks that were staring down at her, Agatha remained composed, carefully noting the angles of each magic circle. Then, with a calm demeanor, she closed her eyes. The magic circles fully formed, glowing red as several streaks of red shot down. Swoosh, swoosh. Each attack moved at incredible speeds. From the moment they appeared and shot down, it only took half a second. Faced with such relentless attacks, Agatha was calm as well. She brought her sword forward and stabbed in all sorts of directions. Her movements were crisp and smooth. Through speed at which the naked eye couldn't see, she stabbed exactly in the spots where Kira's attacks were. Each thrust punctured the center of the energy streaks, dissipating much of their power. At the same time, she made subtle adjustments, shifting small parts of her body just a few inches in specific directions. Through such calculated and minimal movements, she was able to dodge several attacks. This went on for several seconds until all of the spells had rained down. Once she opened her eyes again, Kira stood on the opposite end, her breath slightly heavy. Agatha's lips curled up slightly. "Have you finally gotten tired?" She had been waiting patiently for this moment since the very start. At first, as the fight went on, she had been worried that her opponent had infinite stamina. But it didn't seem to be the case anymore. Agatha drove her foot into the ground and shot forward like a bullet, her speed so tremendous that she left a blur of afterimages in her wake. Sword in hand, she stabbed in Kira's direction. Swoosh. Startled by Agatha's sudden charge, Kira raised her palm, and a wall of flames surged up between them. She thought that would be enough to buy her time, but she thought wrong. Ha! With a slow, deliberate twirl of her sword's tip, Agatha drew the flames that blocked her path toward her blade. With a subtle flick of her wrist, she dispersed the absorbed flames into the air. A small hole appeared, displaying the flustered Kira on the opposite end. Planting her right foot firmly, Agatha slid past the flames and reached Kira's flank. In one fluid motion, she swung her sword toward Kira's exposed back. PFT. Blood leaked out from Kira's back as she stumbled forward. But Agatha wasn't done. Seizing the moment, Agatha's sword flicked forward in a blur, delivering 30 rapid slashes in the span of a single second. Her movements were so swift that Carl, observing the fight in real time, couldn't even track them. Only Jana could, and her expression was filled with admiration. Those watching may not see it, but Agatha has stabbed a total of 31 times in the span of a single second. As you can see, this is the result of such an attack. She pointed toward Kira, more specifically her exposed back, which soon came to view for all those watching as the flames surrounding her died down. Carl took a cold breath. Carl wasn't alone in his reaction. Many of the spectators mirrored his shock, with the younger or more faint-hearted among them turning away as Kira's vulnerable back was laid bare for all to see. Drenched in the color red, all everyone could see was the deep gash on her back as the ground beneath her polled with her own blood. Ugh! In such a state, Kira was able to remain standing, but to those watching, they knew that the match was as good as over. Agatha's stamina was still great, and she hadn't sustained any major injuries. On the opposite side, Kira's stamina was low and she was bleeding profusely. She's done enough, especially against a top 5 contender. If Carl didn't have time to finish his words before Agatha's figure blurred, and she charged toward Kira. Given Kira's condition, Agatha couldn't afford to let her rest and recover. Although she didn't show it, she was actually extremely tired. Even if Kira was about to bleed out, Agatha felt the need to end the fight right this instant to not let an unforeseen variable occur. As such, her focus remained sharp, refusing to let arrogance cloud her judgment. Just like before, she used her abilities to the fullest and skidded over to Kira, who was struggling to keep standing. In a heartbeat, she was already before Kira and their gazes met. A pair of red eyes and a pair of blue eyes. 2 platinum-colored hair. Agatha stabbed forward and, swoosh, hit nothing. Carrying over with the momentum, Agatha stumbled forward. The broadcast panned over to her expression, which was filled with confusion. I hit nothing? How could that be? Where could she? Agatha felt something cold press against her back, and her entire body froze. Following this, the referee's voice echoed. The winner is. His voice quietly echoed through the platform. Kira Milne of the Nuz and Sifa Empire. Agatha looked down to see her shadow squirming before realization dawned on her. Ha, I see. The grip of her sword loosened. With a clank, Her sword fell and she stumbled forward. Thump. She fell face down on the ground, exposing Kira's cold and unamused expression. Her entire body was shrouded in black, with only her deep ruby-red eyes visible. Kira didn't appear pleased with her victory. In fact, she seemed indifferent, her gaze fixed firmly ahead. Toward a distance, a statue stared back at her. It was an angel of sorrow. Chapter 3:15. Sweet one. A strange silence took over the studio as Kira's match came to a sudden end. Neither Carl nor Johanna were able to say a single word as they sat in silence, staring at the figure that stood in the middle of the platform in silence. As the darkness that gripped her body started to fade, revealing the outlines of her body and her platinum-colored hair, Carl silently hissed. Johanna quietly nodded her head as she pursed her lips, replaying the scene from before in her mind. It was just when Agatha was planning to end the match. Her sword twisted through the air, gliding toward Kira's weakened body. It had just been a few inches away from Kira when she disappeared. Even as they slowed down the replay, nobody could see clearly what had happened. Everyone was caught off guard, except for Johanna, who noticed a flicker in Kira's ruby-red eyes just before she vanished. In the next instant, Kira reappeared right behind Agatha, her entire body cloaked in black, with her finger pressed against the back of Agatha's hand. Johanna quietly murmured. It was faint, but enough for Carl to hear as he snapped out of it. Did you just say she's a dual elemental? Johanna nodded as she elaborated. Carl slapped his thigh in realization. It wasn't as though the thought hadn't crossed his mind, but the skill was so quick and weird that he hadn't had the time to properly process the situation. However, upon noticing how the darkness was leaving Kira's body, he understood that she was a dual elemental user. Such users were actually quite rare. It was rather common for a genius to have talent in two different fields. Most of the participants were like that, with only a few specializing in just one category. Nonetheless, the rarest ones were those that had talents that lay in the same category. One such example was Caius, who was talented in the telekinesis and emotive fields, which both belonged to the mind category. Belonging to the same category, they were much easier to practice since the two fields complemented one another. There were many correlations between the two fields, making it easier to excel in both. This allowed them to progress more quickly, as they didn't need to spend as much time practicing each one separately. Kira's profile detailed her as a single attribute, flame user. Her other talent was completely undisclosed. It was for that reason that Johanna and Carl were surprised. This changed a lot of things. Taking a deep breath, Carl watched as Kira gripped the cube and disappeared from the platform. At the same time, Agatha was escorted down by the referee, who waved his hand at once and disappeared alongside her. Watching all of this happen, Carl began to mumble, "That was a wonderful first round of battles." A voice quietly boomed throughout the plaza as the final combatants, Kira and Agatha, stepped off the platform. Yet again, nobody was able to associate the voice with a figure, as the one speaking didn't show themselves. For what reason? I didn't know. I just stood in silence while staring at Kira, who appeared a few moments prior. She was weird. No, she had been acting weird. I pursed my lips. Is it because of what happened to her with her aunt? It made sense when I thought about it. With everything that had happened to her, it was only normal that she'd react this way. But at the same time, since when did she start using her other element? I had hardly ever seen it use it. In fact, most people around her had no idea she wielded two elements, as she typically only used her flame element. This was the first time she had ever displayed her second element, and it was truly terrifying to see. The moment in the first vision was the one that stood out to me the most. I never really quite understood why she had never shown it or used it, but after witnessing her past with the third leaf, I more or less had an idea. She's scared of the dark, or at least was. That no longer seemed to be the case any longer. There are only 24 of you left now, and after such grueling and fierce battles, it's time you were given a well-deserved rest. The voice, hoarse yet authoritative, let out a quiet chuckle. The second stage will begin tomorrow at this time. In the meantime, you are free to do as you please. You can rest, eat, study your opponents, or recover from your injuries. The choice is yours, and we will not restrict your freedom. You are allowed to roam freely around Grimspire or Bremer if you wish. I noticed some of the expressions around me brighten significantly at those words. I felt the same way. My mind was drained, and my body was on the brink of collapse. I needed to recover as quickly as possible. Of course, that wasn't what I was most looking forward to. Can I do it? What I was looking forward to the most was the development of my domain. Since the fight with Angela, it felt as though I had brushed against the edge of something profoundly important. It made my body itch, and I wanted to do nothing more than try it. So long as I carefully worked along those lines, I was confident in further developing my domain. While I still wouldn't be able to fully develop it, I had a feeling that I'd be able to develop it to an extent where it would be usable in fights and boost my strength considerably. That was why, upon hearing the announcement to finish whatever they needed to do, I didn't linger any longer. I headed straight to the nearest inn and booked a room. A single room, please. There were rooms offered specifically for cadets in another inn, but I was in too much of a hurry to head for the portal in Bremer and leave. This was much better for me. Not bad. The room was as simple as could be. It featured dark wooden polish and minimal decoration, with a small window allowing a view of the dark sky and the white sun overhead. A small sofa sat beneath the window, while the bed was positioned in the middle of the room, attached to the wall. A small lamp on the dark wooden desk cast a faint glow over its surface. I glanced around the room briefly before sitting on the bed and closing my eyes. A familiar black world greeted me. I took a deep breath and stared ahead. A familiar red orb materialized in the distance, gradually approaching until it hovered a few meters away from me before coming to a stop. Throb. A gentle throb pulsed through the air as a familiar letter fell from above, coming to rest just beneath the orb. R. My blood boiled at the sight, but I pushed the feeling aside and rejected it. Instead of allowing it to consume me, I forced myself to remain calm. I was taking a different approach from the first time. The next letter followed. Once again, I felt power surging through my body. My muscles tensed and twisted as they strained against the force. I bit my lips, resisting the urge to embrace it, and forced my muscles to relax, pushing aside the power boost. Throb. Gee, the orb squirmed like before. It was as if something within the orb had awakened, causing it to pound and pulse with a strange, rhythmic timing. The interior of the orb throbbed and writhed unnaturally. In that moment, I felt an intense urge to reach out, as if the orb was calling to me. But I resisted the impulse, holding back from extending my hand. Throb. Throb. The orb throbbed with even more intensity, calling for me to touch it, but I clenched my teeth and held back. KH. Sweat poured down my forehead. My face spasmed as I looked ahead, my eyes stinging as I forced myself to keep them open. Couldn't miss it. I had to see it. That was when a new letter appeared. E. Everything stopped at that moment. The orb stopped pulsing, and so did the calling sensation. A strange silence enveloped the empty space as the orb emitted a faint crimson glow. Beneath it, a four-letter word slowly appeared. Rage. I felt my mouth go dry as I stared at the words and the floating orb above them. For a brief moment, I extended my hand toward it. The orb squirmed and came to life, reaching out to me as if in greeting. It was just a finger length away from reaching me before I stopped. No, not yet. I wanted to see more. That was when something else caught my vision. It was a green orb. Just like the red orb, it appeared in the distance before coming forward and stopping right next to the red orb. It stopped for a moment before a familiar letter appeared from above. Throb. J. The changes that occurred in my body were different. My muscles still squirmed, but this time the sensation was more focused, targeting my calves and legs. But what exactly was it? Throb. The orb throbbed again, and the pain in my head intensified. I bit my lips and resisted. More. I want to see more. Throb. Oh. The muscles in my calves squirmed and twisted as a hidden energy I hadn't experienced before surged through them. My mind began to ache, and my vision blurred as time seemed to slow down, each moment stretching out before me. Looking down, I saw several outlines of my hand tracing its path. Each time I moved my hand, two outlines followed, creating a weird trail. How odd. It was strange. As I looked ahead, the orb once again seemed to call out to me, squirming like the first one had. It throbbed and squirmed violently, but I ignored it. Throb. The last letter arrived. My head shook and I stumbled back. Uck. But not before seeing the last letter. Why? Gazing at the orb beside the other one, I placed my hand on my chest and read the words beneath each orb. Rage. Ha joy. I saw a pattern in all of this. Soon, a new orb appeared in the distance. It was blue in color and began moving toward me. It headed in the direction of the two orbs, and as I stared at it, my vision shook. Whack. I felt a certain throbbing pain and my eyes flared open. Uck. Squirming on the ground, I clutched my head and rolled around for a few seconds. Despite being accustomed to pain, this was something I couldn't endure. It was a pain so intense and disorienting that it sent my body into shock. Bang. I thrashed my surroundings, sending the lamp crashing to the ground and tearing the bedsheets apart in the process. It hurt. It hurt so much. Bang bang. Uck. It only came to a stop after a full minute, by which time the floor was covered in sweat and torn sheets. Ha! Ha! Breathing heavily, I leaned against the bed's frame and took deep, steady breaths to calm myself. I've overdone it. In my excitement, I overexerted my mental energy. This was especially bad considering that I had yet to recover from the fight. In my excitement, I neglected myself. Ha! I clenched my teeth. The pain just refused to leave. As I bit my lips, I felt something in my pocket. Fiddling with it for a few seconds, I pulled out a small chocolate bar. I stared at the chocolate bar for a few seconds before popping it into my mouth and chewing. In that moment of pain, I forgot about all the hate that I had for sweets and savored the taste. The pain started to subside, and I was able to finally breathe in peace. Finally opening my eyes, I let out a long breath. Still too sweet, but it wasn't too bad. Chapter 3:16. Sweet, 2. I sat in silence for what felt like an hour, but when I checked the time, only a few minutes had elapsed. With a small sigh, I licked my teeth and stood up. The sweetness from the chocolate was still lingering in my taste buds, and I winched slightly. It had helped me suppress the pain, but at the same time, feeling how sweet my mouth had become, I started to feel regret. How in the world can she eat something this sweet without a problem? I was growing more and more concerned for Delilah's health. She was a superhuman, one of the strongest at that, but surely it wasn't good for her to eat stuff that was this sweet. Not that I'm any better. I was the one feeding that addiction of hers. Rising my mouth in the sink, I took a deep breath and stared at my reflection. Even now, I found it hard to get used to what I saw in the reflection. The sharply defined jawline and the intense, piercing hazel eyes that seemed to look straight through me were still unfamiliar. Not that I wasn't sure how I looked, but this look seemed a little bit too perfect. Ha. The thought made me laugh a little. As I stared at my reflection, I was suddenly reminded of something. A certain vision. The angel. With everything that had happened, I had no time to think about the angel. All my thoughts had been on what I had seen in the tomb, and when I came back into the plaza, the second phase had already started. It was only now that I had time to rest that I was reminded of the quest, and my eyes squinted. Things have been a little quiet. By now, I had half expected something to happen to me, especially when I was reminded of the vision I had seen, and yet, nothing of the sort occurred. Rather, things were strangely calm. Too calm for my own comfort. I knew that something was brewing, but what exactly? And could I do anything about it? Can I just directly destroy the statue? I discarded the thought rather quickly. Though I didn't know much about the statue, I could tell that it held some sort of significance to the city of Grimspire. If I were to destroy it like that, then I'd be in a whole world of trouble. Then, to talk, a sudden knock broke me out of my thoughts. I looked at the door in both confusion and concern. Nobody should be aware of where I'm staying. Neither Leon nor the professors knew where I was. I had left abruptly and didn't explain a single thing. The sudden knock made me somewhat wary, but of course it could also just be room service. I approached the door with caution. To talk, who could it be? Clank. I ended up opening the door and opened my eyes wide. A weird sound accompanied my shock as a figure I was all too familiar with appeared at the entrance of the door. With long flowing black hair, a face that could only be described with the word alien, and a stiff expression, Delilah appeared on the other side of the door. I blinked several times, unable to hide my shock. The shock didn't stem from her appearance. By now I had grown used to her antics and was always prepared for her to show up unannounced. The shock came from the fact that she knocked on the door. Since when do you knock? Delilah tilted her head, allowing her black hair to gently fall to the side of her shoulder and exposing the nape of her neck. As her eyes fluttered in confusion, she looked around the room for a brief moment before her eyes settled over a certain spot, toward a certain wrapper. Her pursed lips, and for the faintest of moments I thought I saw a smile. What? Nothing. Delilah entered the room and sat down, folding her legs as she did so. She then glanced around the room. You're as messy as me. About that. I closed the door behind me and sighed. Without worrying about anyone overhearing our conversation, I told her the truth. From how I was developing a domain to how I had overexerted my mind in the process. Oh, Delilah nodded in understanding. It happened to me as well. Not satisfied with what she said, her brows squirmed for a second before she added, my room was like this too. Your room is like this regardless of whether you overexert your mind or not. I held my comment back. Though I didn't think Delilah would hit me for a comment like that, I wasn't too keen on finding out. It was hard to read a woman like her. Looking around, I started to clean up while Delilah quietly watched from the side. I wasn't too bothered by this since I was used to it. Her presence. Right? Since she's here, I can take this time to ask her about my domain. Surely she'd know of a way to help me. Picking up one of the torn sheets, I casually looked her way and asked, is there a way to develop my concept faster? Delilah cocked her head before shaking her head. I don't know. Talk about useful. As if she could read my thoughts, Delilah continued. All concepts are different. I don't know your concept. How should I know? I learned mine quickly. It's something that you need to figure out on your own. A concept was based on someone's visualization and mind. It was created after one's experiences and desires, which was what Delilah was trying to explain. I guess I'm being impatient. I needed to stop overthinking and just quietly ponder over the domain. It would eventually come with time. That much I was sure. Couldn't rush it. As my thoughts cleared up, I tossed all the ripped-up sheets on the bed and patted my hands. I'm done. I'll have to pay for this later, but it probably shouldn't be too much. Oh, I suddenly recalled something and looked at Delilah. Entering the world within the ring, I rushed to the back of the building where all my items were stored and reached for a black bone which I took out and showed to her. Can you help me sell this? A wraith bone. With her sharp eyes, Delilah was able to easily tell what the bone was. She took it from my hand and closely examined it. You do not want it? No. I shook my head after a little bit of thought. I only had 2 slots left and I wanted to make the best out of them. Perhaps I was greedy, but I wanted them to belong to unique monsters that would also serve as potential wills like Pebble and Almighty. The reason why I asked Delilah to sell this was because she had connections and I wasn't afraid they'd scam her. Or maybe they would. Taking a look at her, I pursed my lips. She won't get scammed, right? Here. Contrary to my expectations, she didn't take the bone directly and just tossed me a small bag of coins. I caught the bag, which weighed pretty heavily with a dumbfounded expression. This is money. But I'm buying it. I didn't know how to answer that. Looking down and seeing the hefty bag of coins, I could only flick my head between her and the sack. In the end, I didn't ask any questions and just kept the money. Delilah appeared satisfied by that as she brushed her hair behind her ear. With a thoughtful look on her face, she changed the topic of conversation. Do you remember the reason why you learned your intent? The reason? I do. How could I not? It was right after the play and I had locked the love emotion. Ever since reaching the late stage of Tier 3, a nagging feeling crept up at the back of my mind, hinting at something. I hadn't been so sure of the reason, but it all became clear to me once I unlocked the last emotion. Coming into full circle, I was able to unlock my intent, which was closely tied to my emotions. In that sense, it also fitted very well with what I had come up with so far with my concept. It was just that it was taking a lot of time for me to properly create a concept. Each orb had its own properties, representing the corresponding emotion. I had yet to fully figure out how it worked, but I could more or less guess. I told most of this to Delilah, whose face turned slightly stiff. You unlocked your intent after learning about love? Yes. In the play. Yes. With the princess? Right. Where was she getting at? Delilah's face gradually returned back to normal as she pursed her lips. Her black eyes reached out for me as I looked back at her. Our eyes locked for a few seconds, finding myself unconsciously wandering over her features. I had always known this, but Delilah was truly very beautiful. So beautiful that she looked alien to me. In the midst of my thoughts, Delilah brought her hand forward. Use it. Snapping out of it, I looked down at her hand and tilted my head. Use what? Love, Delilah said with a straight face. Try using it on me. I felt my brows jump. What did she say? This came out of nowhere and I had a hard time figuring out her intentions. But in the end, seeing how serious her expression was, I nodded my head. Perhaps she can help me. I reached down to grab her hand. And just as I did, I noticed something. Oh! It was on her finger and it looked oddly familiar. That was when I looked at my hand. No wonder. I raised my brow in surprise as my head flicked up to look at Delilah. What? Delilah's expression remained the same despite noticing where I was looking at. Bah! Thump! I felt my heartbeat drum inside of my mind as I alternated my gaze between the 2 identical rings in our hands. Then, a dangerous thought crossed my mind. It was so dangerous that I felt my breath leave my body. However, when I thought about her past behavior, the idea ran wildly inside my mind. Perhaps I was overthinking, but I wasn't sure. Raising my head to meet her gaze, my mouth opened as I asked, You can't possibly like me? Chapter 3:17. Sweet. 3. The more I thought about it, the more plausible the idea was from how she suddenly gave me chocolate to the times when she would randomly show up unannounced. I wasn't very good at picking up these things, but I also didn't think I was dense. It was for that reason that I found myself believing the notion. Licking my dry lips, I opened my mouth. You can't possibly like me. No. Delilah coldly shook her head and answered before I could finish my sentence. It left me speechless, and at the same time a little disappointed. But I shook those feelings away. What was I even thinking? Okay. I dropped the topic there and pressed my hand against hers. Right. Maybe I'm overthinking. Focusing all my attention on her palm, I tried using love on her. The results were as expected. Delilah didn't react much as she sat in silence, seemingly waiting for something to happen. But that something never happened. It's not working. Delilah took her hand back before standing up. Brushing her silky black hair past her ear, she looked around before heading for the door. Just before reaching the door, she paused. Though I couldn't see her back, she looked pretty conflicted. In the end, she ended up saying, "There's an imbalance between your understanding of the 6 emotions. Your weakest is love. Improve that." Clank. Those were the last words that she said before she left. In the silence that took over the room, I stared in her direction, at a loss for words. I leaned my head back and helplessly stared at the ceiling. How in the world am I supposed to do that? My thoughts paused when I noticed something from the corner of my vision. Slowly turning my head, I spotted a familiar chocolate bar resting on the desk. Reaching out for it, I paused when I noticed that it was missing all of its contents besides one small piece. I stared at it for a brief moment before putting the bar down and murmuring, "You'll be the death of me." A notification flashed in my vision. Coming out of the room, Delilah stood in silence for a brief moment. Her brows wiggled slightly as she fell into deep thought. She rummaged through her pocket and took out a small chocolate bar. Unwrapping the paper, she was in the process of bringing it to her lips when she stopped. Delilah then opened her mouth and tried again, but stopped again. In the end, for the first time since she could remember, she wrapped the chocolate bar and placed it in her pocket. Fiddling with her hand, and tracing her finger over the ring on her finger, she quietly mumbled, "Maybe." Her figure started to blur. "I don't understand." Within a quiet room in Grimspire, creak. The wooden floor creaked under a certain step as a figure calmly sat down on the bed within the room. The room was neither big nor small. It was large enough to fit the basic decorations as Kira silently sat down on the bed with a blank expression. Her ruby-red eyes continuously flickered as her expression slowly started to twist. The veins at the top of her forehead started to bulge while her face started to spasm. Her eyes shook, and her entire body started to tremble. Uck! Foam started forming in her mouth as her eyes lost clarity. At that moment, Kira clenched her teeth tightly as she smashed her fist against the side of the bed. Bang! Despite the bedding, the bed shattered in an instant as her body shot up. "Fucking! Get the fuck out!" Regaining some semblance of clarity, Kira held onto her head as she thrashed around the room, gripping the desk while screaming. Uck! Her vision grew dark. In that moment, Kira stopped struggling as she started hugging her body. No, not this place again. A blurred figure appeared in her consciousness. The image of the blurred figure became clearer and clearer to Kira as she sank deeper and deeper into her consciousness. It stared back at her with the same expression. One that was filled with sorrow. "What do you want?" Kira screamed in her consciousness. It had been days since she had felt trapped in her own body, and days since she was able to see the figure. It had slowly started to take control of her body, inserting more and more of its influence on her. But she wasn't the only one. Kira knew this. There were several others it had affected. It was just that she didn't know to what extent the number of those who had been influenced was. "Say something." Kira's ruby-red eyes glowed menacingly as she glared at the statue that stood before her. But her words were met with an empty silence as the statue kept its gaze fixed on her with its hollow and sorrowful eyes. Ark! Kira rushed toward the statue. But just as she did, she snapped back to reality, her eyes flying open as she realized she was back in her own room. Kira stumbled several times before coming to a stop in front of her desk which she used to support herself. Ha! With heavy breaths, she gripped the desk tightly, biting her lip until she felt a warm trickle down her chin. Unfazed by the pain, her eyes frantically scanned the desk, finally locking onto a small orb. She reached for it quickly. It was a communication device. So long as she could tell someone, "Yuk!" But just as she reached for it, her hand froze, trembling uncontrollably. It was as if an invisible force had seized her arm, holding it in place and stopping her from moving any further. "Let go, damn it!" Kira's eyes turned bloodshot as the veins down her neck bulged, her expression contorting in agony. Gradually, she felt her consciousness begin to slip away, sinking back into that dark place. No! The thought of returning to that dark place sent her into a panic. She forced her eyelids open and, with every ounce of strength she had left, reached desperately for the communication device. She came close to the communication device. Kira extended her hand, her fingertip almost brushing against it. Just a little bang. Uck! Her entire body was suddenly flung backward, crashing against the wall at the back of the room. She collapsed to the floor, coughing violently as she struggled to catch her breath. Cough! Cough. Her mind spun and her eyelids grew heavy. In her fading vision, she could see the darkness creeping in from the edges, slowly closing in around her. Ugh! With a groan, Kira turned to her left and opened her palm, revealing a small communication device. She silently smirked before she mustered the little amount of energy in her before and speaking. Angel, statue, possess. Kira faded into her consciousness shortly after that. The room fell silent as Kira's grip slackened, and the communication device slipped from her hand, rolling across the wooden floor. It tumbled for several seconds before a foot came down on it, stopping it in its tracks. Kira bent down, her ruby-red eyes glowing faintly as she picked up the device. She stared at the name displayed on it, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she crushed the device in her hand, shattering it into fine powder. Aoife K. Megrail. After the first round of fights concluded, the injured combatants were escorted to Grimspire's medical facility. The facility was situated far from the plaza, toward the lower end of the city, where space was more abundant, a necessity for such a large establishment. Fortunately, Grimspire wasn't a particularly large city. It was only about 1/10 the size of Bremer, with a population of roughly 100,000 people. In the medical facility. How are you feeling? Amel quietly observed Agatha, who lay on the bed with a pale complexion and lips pressed together. Her long platinum hair was spread out over the pillow, and her icy blue eyes reflected a glimmer of sorrow. She lay like that for several seconds before murmuring, I thought I'd win that. I really thought. Agatha bit her lips, recalling the last fight. In that moment when she thrust her sword, she could remember sighing in relief and feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She thought she had won, and yet, clench. Not only did she carry the heavy burden of representing her empire, but she also carried the burden of bearing the title of the next Sword Saint. Losing was unacceptable for her, especially when it came from someone who was ranked far beneath her. She felt as though she had let down those of her empire and her family. The more she thought about the situation, the more her chest stung. If only. I get it. Amel stopped her before she could continue. He could see the regret on her face as she blankly stared at the ceiling. Agatha was usually the cheerful one while he was the brooding one, always thinking about his past and his brother. Seeing how weak and frail she looked, Amel knew that it was now his job to act like her support. But not only that, he was also the only one left who had any chance of granting their empire victory. Before he had Agatha to share that burden with him, but now, who? He took a deep breath and took out a small rectangular device. Noticing his actions, Agatha tilted her head to look in his direction, wondering what he was doing. Without looking up at her, he answered, I'm looking at the matches of all the other participants. I want to study each one of them so that I don't lose carelessly or unexpectedly. Really? Amel's words surprised Agatha as she sat up from the bed. Having known Amel for as long as she could remember, she understood his personality best. Coming here, he showed no regard to the other fighters, nor did he care who was ranked first or second. He acted like someone who couldn't care less about competition, but this was actually the furthest thing from the truth. Amel was quite competitive, but he was also arrogant in his own way. He never once looked at a profile, be it on paper or in real life, because he was confident in his own abilities. It was his unconscious way of saying that he looked down on everyone. Agatha, on the other hand, was usually the cautious type, always looking at her opponent's profiles and whatnot, but that was in the past. Spending so much time with Amel, his attitude started to rub off on her as well, hence her lack of preparation for her opponent. As the room fell into a state of silence as Amel started to look through the profiles, he stopped after a certain point, his expression slowly starting to stiffen. What's wrong? Noticing the abnormalities in Amel's expression, Agatha reached for him, but just as she did, Amel raised his head abruptly, dropping the device in his hand and hurrying out. His actions shook Agatha as she tried to reach for him with her hand. Wait, where are you going? But she got no response as he smacked the door behind him, leaving her in the room stunned. It was then that she lowered her head and noticed the profile flickering on the device. Her eyes widened in surprise as she read the information. Leon Ellert. Age. 19. Empire. Nuz and Sifa. Weapon. Sword. Eye color. Gray. Chapter 318. The second round 1. Ha! Ha! Amel ran around the entire Grimspire. His thoughts were in a jumbled mess and all he did was run around, his eyes scanning the crowd as he navigated through the crowd at speeds at which they couldn't fathom. Swoosh! With a gust of wind, some of the people even found themselves looking up toward the raging ball of white that hung in the graying sky with confused expressions. It's a little windy today, isn't it? What are you talking about? Wind? What wind? We're in the mirror dimension. Of course, there were a few that did notice Amel. Grimspire was a place that was filled with powerful superhumans. While Amel was strong, there were many that were stronger. But he didn't care. He continued to run around the entire city looking for one specific individual. There were obviously better ways to go about this, but his thoughts were in such a mess that he found himself unable to think properly. It was only when he found himself stopping to catch his breath that he realized how stupid his actions were. Ha! What am I even doing? He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the top of his shirt. Amel took a deep breath and calmly recovered his breath. Once he did so, his thoughts returned to normal as he took out a communication device and spoke into it. Find me all the information possible regarding Leon Ellert, who is participating in the summit. His voice was cold, laced with an authority that befitted someone of his status. His entire demeanor shifted as he surveyed his surroundings. He stood in a grim alley, hemmed in by two thick walls on either side. Colorful graffiti marred the surfaces, and he cast a brief, disdainful glance at them. Tisk! He clicked his tongue at the sight of them. Understood. It was only after he heard a voice coming from the communication device that he put it away. He took a deep breath after that and calmed his unsteady heart. Right, I shouldn't jump to conclusions. Just because he's got gray eyes and looks a little like father doesn't mean that it's him. But what if he actually is him? How should he approach him? Amel gripped his chest as he leaned against the side of the wall. His thoughts were complicated, but in all those thoughts he realized something. We searched all over the entire empire before father and mother gave up. But what if? He took a deep breath, forcefully suppressing his raging emotions. What if he had left the empire long ago? Bremer. Royal Estate. Aoife strolled through the quiet, expansive halls of the estate, her steps muffled by the thin red carpet beneath her. As she walked, her gaze drifted over to the paintings that lined the walls. Each one depicted a chapter in the story of the Megrail family, from its humble beginnings to its rise as the powerful behemoth it had become today. Aoife's steps came to a pause as she turned around. There, she spotted a familiar figure and her cheeks twitched. I just saw you like an hour ago. Aoife held her tongue back before smiling. Brother. Haha. Fancy seeing you here, Aoife. Aoife stopped herself from rolling her eyes and kept the smile on her face. She loved her brother, but at the same time he was really exhausting to be with. He had always been attached to her, but ever since the incident a while back, his level of attachment increased by a lot. It was to the point where Aoife felt helpless. Yet, seeing the sickly complexion on her brother's face, she couldn't bring herself to refuse him. He was suffering so much. As Gale approached, he glanced at the paintings with a smile. You usually are so indifferent to the paintings. It's the first time that I've seen you show some interest. Well, you can say so. No, not really. She had merely just given them a fleeting glance. Aoife knew about the entire history of the Megrail family by heart. It was something that had been ingrained into her brain since young. For that reason, even though she never looked at the paintings properly, she knew exactly what each scene represented. Oh, that's great. Gale looked quite happy by Aoife's words. Aoife used to show her disdain for anything that was related to their family in the past. She had some pride for it, but she never really cared for their history. This was a nice change, especially since their history was so important. There's a lot of great things that you can learn by going through the history. In the midst of his speech, Aoife stopped paying attention as she felt her pocket vibrate. Frowning, she took out her communication device and looked at the message. Seeing the message, her brows furrowed tightly. Angel. Sorrow. Possession. Was Kira drunk? Aoife bit her lips. She really thought that was the case, but at the same time, felt the irregularity in the message to be quite concerning. Especially since Kira wasn't the type to send messages like this. In fact, besides the occasional, fuck you, she'd send on occasion, Kira usually never messaged her. Something is up. Glancing up and noticing her brother still engrossed in talking about their family history, Aoife saw her opportunity. She quietly slipped out of the room and made her way directly out of the estate, heading toward where Kira was supposed to be. Dorset, the great founding emperor, was a man of great achievements. And, it was only after a couple of minutes had passed that Gale realized that his sister had disappeared. He looked around frantically before bitterly smiling. I guess she left. He turned his head to look at one of the paintings. The painting depicted a lone man standing tall as he confronted over 1,000 Halloween figures as they charged at him from all sides. The sky was a murky gray, and tall, grand buildings connected by bridges stood in the background. It was an imposing image, capturing the brilliance and indomitable spirit of their founding emperor. As Gale's eyes traced over the painting, they eventually settled on the words written beneath it. The battle of the custody of nothing in a brutal and relentless fight. The founding emperor, Dorset, waged war day and night against the remnants of the Empire of Nothing. For several nights, he battled. Gale stared at the description for a few seconds before covering his mouth. Heh! In what almost seemed to be a scoff. He leaned his hand against the wall before suddenly coughing. Cough! Cough! The coughing fit lasted several seconds, leaving his face pale. When he finally moved his hand away and saw the blood staining his palm, he turned back to face the painting. He stared at it for a good second before leaving. As he left, he mumbled, "Not a bad painting." The next day, it had been a while since I'd slept so soundly. Exhaustion combined with the events of the previous day with Delilah allowed me to rest without any issues. In fact, I felt extremely refreshed. What time is it? Lying in bed, I checked my watch to see the time. It's still morning. It was around 7 a.m., still early in the day. The second round was scheduled to begin in the afternoon, at around 5 p.m. With plenty of time to spare before the upcoming matches, I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and let myself drift into the familiar world of darkness. It was then that 6 orbs appeared before me. Late last night, I pushed myself further. There were now 3 more orbs within my consciousness. Each orb had its own distinctive color, and words beneath it. Red RAG, green JOY, blue sorrow, pink affection, purple affair, azure shock. I looked at the words and colors with a mix of different emotions. It's weird. There was something about the colors and names that felt a little odd to me. Instead of seeing the standard 6 emotions, I saw 3 new emotions: shock, affection, and sorrow. In a sense, each word belonged to one of the standard emotions that was present. But what was the reason for their appearance? I was left confused by this point, and the more I dwelled on it, the more confused I became. I realized that unless I figured this out, then I wouldn't be able to develop my domain further. And that would be a little problematic. Ha! I opened my eyes and let out a long and exhausted sigh. My mind was a little drained, but I wasn't too worried. So long as I didn't continue expanding my concept, then I wouldn't need to worry about recuperating before my match in the afternoon. Thinking about the match, I wonder who my opponent is. They said it'd be announced right before the matches started, leaving everyone with no proper time to analyze our opponent. This was probably what the top brass wanted, and I could only resign myself to their decision as I got dressed and left the apartment. Asterisk. The streets of Grimspire were paved with cobblestones, a common feature of the architecture in the mirror dimension. Overall, the architecture of the supply stations and cities in the mirror dimension differed significantly from that of cities on the outside, displaying a more Gothic style compared to the more contemporary design of Bremer. This was perhaps due to the gray sky above, which cast a dark gloom over the entire surroundings, making it a more fitting design. Could be a game design thing? If this was even still a game. As I walked along the cobblestone street, city lamps flickered intermittently. I glanced at the Gothic-style buildings with their slender spires reaching toward the sky and French windows draped with thin veils. With the location of the inn, I found it somewhat near to the main plaza. There were quite a lot of people walking about. If not for the gloomy sky and the harsh, scorching sun overhead, the place might have seemed much more lively. Eventually, I stopped at a small coffee shop to take a break. The shop was modest in design, featuring planters arranged outside to create a small, secluded area with metal chairs and tables where one could sit and relax. I found a comfortable spot, located near the corner, and sat down. "How may I help you?" "Standard, please." I pointed at the waiter who took my order without showing much of a reaction to me before leaving. It was only then that I sighed in relief. Good thing he hasn't seen through the illusion. With the 4-Empire Summit broadcasted to all 4 empires, the participants were in a sense celebrities. It'd be difficult to do anything unless one went undercover. That was exactly why I had to cast an illusion over my features. It was so that I wouldn't be recognized, especially when my face was easy to recognize. In the midst of my thoughts, I felt a shadow cast over my area. Thinking that it was the waiter, I raised my head, lifting my hand to receive my coffee. When I stopped, a figure I didn't recognize stood directly opposite me. With brown hair and brown eyes, his features seemed rather ordinary. He wore a white shirt tucked neatly into his pants. At first glance, he looked completely normal. In fact, he gave off a nice feeling with a warm smile on his face. "May I sit here?" And yet, every hair on my body stood. Taking my silence as silent confirmation, the young man pulled the chair back and sat down. With the same smile as before, he prepared to open his mouth when I cut him off. "So, first it was the theater performance, and then this." I narrowed my eyes, silently staring at the person in front of me who appeared completely foreign to me, but at the same time knew who he was. "Are you purposely trying to annoy me?" Chapter 319. The second round, 2. Certain people give off certain vibes. As someone who had once been a salesman, it was my job to pay close attention to a person's traits and characteristics, from their little habits to their personal likes. It was for that reason that upon seeing the young man in front of me, I felt that something was familiar. It didn't take long for me to associate the sense of familiarity. What are you talking about? His hair color was different, and so was the color of his eyes. However, upon closer look, he had the same general tilt to his head when he walked. The same little habit of pursing his lips before smiling, and the same serene and calm look that displayed his utter confidence. There was obviously a chance that I could be wrong, but I lost nothing by acting like this. Furthermore, I was almost certain about my intuition. I had observed the person who had taken my role in Olga's play for long enough to notice this. What do you want? Just some coffee. His calmness in response to my actions was also something to take note of. Not only did he seem unfazed by what I had said, but he even went ahead and ordered himself some coffee while smiling at me. It was only when our orders came that he talked again. The coffee's nice, isn't it? He started off the conversation by talking about the coffee. Seeing that he still had not left, I sighed and took a sip of my own coffee. Since I wasn't worried about him doing anything to me considering we were in a public place, I could only sit and get a better understanding of the situation. The first thing that I wanted to figure out was who in the world he was. Someone from the organization? That could very well be possible. In that case, I needed to be careful with my words. It's decent. I placed the cup down. He did so as well as he smiled yet again. How did you figure it out? The same way that you've figured me out. Oh, he looked surprised by my words. But to be honest, I had no idea how he figured it out. I was just speaking out of my ass. He looked around before turning my attention back to me and blinking his eyes, displaying his yellow pupils and hair for a brief moment before returning to his original appearance. The moment his appearance was revealed, I had to try my best to hide my shock. This isn't what I expected. The one that sat before me wasn't a member of the organization. At least, the one that belonged to this empire. No, rather, he was the #1 ranked person in the summit. Caius. Now, why would he be looking for me? My thoughts started to run rather quickly, as I thought back to all possibilities. I thought about how he had taken the role from me, and the possible reasons for why he would do so. In the end, it didn't take me more than a minute to understand his intentions. You're insecure about your emotive abilities. I ended up blurting out my thoughts without realizing it. Caius's hand, which was about to pick up his cup, froze. What did you say? He looked at me with a ridiculous expression. Insecure about my emotive abilities? Yes. I doubled down since I had already said my piece. Why else would you take over my role in the play? Ha ha ha. Caius suddenly laughed, leaning back against the chair and slapping his thigh in the process. His laugh echoed loudly within the small and secluded area as he continued to slap his thigh as though I had said the funniest thing ever. He went on like this for a good minute before finally wiping the corner of his eyes. That was funny. He shifted his attention back to me, his expression still carrying a smile. I took your role because I could. You ended up being a nosehow, and in her desperation, Olga took me. It's not my fault you didn't show up. It wasn't as though I had the intention of taking your role in order to show that my emotive magic is better. I'm not buying that. Oh, you wouldn't have left the play had that been the case. Ha! Caius looked a little stumped after hearing that. He seemed unsure of what to say. In the end, he could only shrug. I just thought your play was quite nice, and didn't see the need to perform any longer. So that's why you left? You can say so. I almost burst out laughing. He was bullshitting again. Though I didn't quite pay attention to what happened to Olga after I left. Considering that nobody said a thing about it, they appeared to have found a last-minute replacement. It wasn't uncommon for plays to have backup actors in case one didn't show up. But I also knew that she didn't receive her desired performance. The fact that no one had been talking about it showed that it wasn't that well received by those that she wanted to impress. But at least this was what I had assumed. I honestly couldn't have cared less about her at this point. Well, if you say so. I took another sip of the coffee before placing the cup down. It's definitely not because you saw all that you needed to see and assured yourself that your emotive magic is better than mine, right? Caius smiled. You're again going with that? It's the truth, isn't it? Think what you like. In the end, he shrugged and moved forward, reaching his hand to grasp mine. The fuck? In the end, facts speak for themselves. Suddenly, a jolt shot through my mind, and my heart began to pound uncontrollably. My entire body trembled as a chilling cold swept over me, my muscles tightening in response. I tried to resist, but I found it hard to do so. My mind was still exhausted from having developed the domain this morning, and so I found myself unable to extricate myself from his actions. Thankfully, the sensation didn't last long. Caius took his hand away as soon as he placed it, smiling at me with the same confident smile. Feeling sweat cover the side of my face, I looked up to see Caius smiling down at me. See, he downed the coffee in front of him before standing up. You still think we're at the same level? He chuckled slightly before shaking his head and turning. Placing a couple of bills on the table, he proceeded to leave. I sat in silence for a good minute, staring at his departing back before taking a deep breath. He really was insecure. Why else would he do something like this? Nonetheless, after experiencing his emotive magic, I had to say that he was rather skilled. But it was just that. I turned my head and once again stared at his back where a small glowing tag appeared. I'm better. I extended my hand and prepared to snap my fingers when I froze. With rigid movements, I turned my head and saw a man I didn't recognize. Holding onto a small cup, he stood there, his mouth agape, as a stream of liquid dribbled from his lips. His face was eerily still, and his eyes were bloodshot. Flick, flick. As his head flicked from my hand to the seat opposite me, he took a step back, unable to disguise the shock and horror from his face. It seemed to say, again. His disguise flickered along his expression, revealing an all too familiar figure. I stared back at my hand before feeling my mouth twitch. What's with you and your timing? What happened here? It wasn't difficult for Aoife to discover Kira's whereabouts. As the princess of the empire, she had eyes and ears in nearly every corner of the two cities. With little effort, she pinpointed where Kira resided and made her way to her directly. Aoife wanted to get a better understanding of what her message meant, but upon entering the room, she was shocked to see that it was in complete ruins. The bed was shattered, the desk split in half, and the wall partially collapsed. Before arriving at the inn, Aoife noticed that the innkeeper had already contacted the guards to report the situation. Several people stood nearby, peering into the room with curious expressions on their faces. There's likely been a conflict, princess. As you can see from the damage to the wall, it's clear someone was thrown against it with considerable force. The table and bed, on the other hand, seem to have been broken by a simpler attack. The strangest part of all this, however, is that there's no evidence of a second person being involved. The guard seemed to be at a loss as he explained, scratching his head in embarrassment. Aoife quietly stood while nodding her head. It appears everything was done by a single individual. If you give us some time, we can uncover more details about the situation. As she listened, she was reminded of Kira's message. Possessed. She also recalled the strange behavior that Kira exhibited during the first round of combat, and her expression underwent a subtle change. Princess. Oh no, nothing. She only snapped out of it when the knight called for her. Putting on a smile, she thanked him wholeheartedly before leaving. As she left the building, Aoife directly headed for the royal library. Near the Megrail estate stood a grand, white dome-shaped building, covering a vast plot of land and towering over most of the surrounding structures. It was one of the tallest buildings in the city, surpassed only by the 7 great cathedrals, each representing one of the 7 gods. The insides of the library were just as one would expect. Tall shelves lined the walls, filled with thousands of books. At the far end of the library, a tall window let in light that gleamed on the polished marble floor. A spiral staircase ascended to a platform that encircled the library, where even taller shelves were packed with more books. The number of books that were present in the royal library counted hundreds of thousands, with almost the entire world's knowledge located in the library. Organizing such a vast number of books and locating a specific desired one would seem like a difficult task. But fortunately, the librarians in charge had nearly every book memorized. It was with one of their help that Aoife was able to find the book that she wanted. Epic of the Rilgona Monarchy. Seated at one of the wooden desks in the library, Aoife opened the thick book before her and skimmed through the pages. She had a general understanding of the Rilgona monarch, one of the few ancient monarchies that had once existed in the mirror dimension. They had evolved beyond the era of the Shattered World, transitioning into the Age of Umbral Dominion. Though details were scarce due to their distant past, the collected scriptures, statues, murals, and text provided them with enough information to put some of the pieces together. If there was one thing that was unknown, it was how the monarchy ended. That was still a mystery that was left unsolved to this day. Letting out a small exclamation, Aoife's eyes paused on a certain page. Titled Angel of Sorrow, a picture stood beneath the title, displaying the all-too-familiar statue that she had seen in the main plaza of Grimspire. The Angel of Sorrow remains among the most mysterious relics belonging to the once mighty Rilgona monarchy. This statue, an image of a mournful angel with an outstretched hand, as if pleading for mercy, now resides in the main plaza of Grimspire. Aoife began to read, murmuring quietly as she read. It was a habit that she developed during her childhood, mainly because reading out loud helped her memorize the information more. While little is known about the sculptor who fashioned this poignant figure, recovered fragments of ancient texts suggest that the statue symbolizes a significant yet grim chapter in their history, an event referred to as the Night of the Scattered Death. Aoife frowned while reading the next. Night of the Scattered Death. This sounded rather haunting, Historical records depict the Night of the Scattered Death as one of the most catastrophic episodes in the history of the Rilgona monarchy. Chroniclers of the time described it as an act of divine wrath, with the gods unleashing their fury upon the people. On that fateful night, countless citizens were overcome by madness, turning against their own kin and companions in a frenzy of violence. This horrifying event left a deep mark on the collective memory of the monarchy, being one of the discussed reasons for the monarch's downfall. The Night of the Scattered Death was without precedent, a calamity that shook the very foundations of the Rilgona monarchy. Despite the full exertion of the royal family's power, the chaos proved nearly impossible to sustain, with many of the royal members also falling for this madness. By the time the madness was quelled, the streets were already dyed with the blood of countless citizens who had perished in the chaos. Yet, the most chilling aspect of this event was not the numerous deaths, but what resulted in such deaths. In a turn of events, the madness-driven citizens, as if driven by a singular, dreadful force, simultaneously ended their own lives. Each one decapitated themselves, holding their heads in their hands in the same manner as the statue, as if they were offering it to the gods in the sky. Aoife paused for a brief moment, taking a deep breath as her eyes lifted toward the statue, and her mind forming an image of over 1,000 people, offering their heads in the same position. She felt her entire body turn cold. The general consensus among historians is that the Night of the Scattered Death was triggered by the sudden outbreak of a plague. Yet, there are those who argue that it was an expression of divine wrath, a punishment from the gods, given the nature of their deaths. However, upon closer examination of the ancient texts and the deciphering of the symptoms described, many scholars now believe that the true cause of the event was something altogether different. Aoife felt her reading slow down upon reaching this point. She had a feeling that she was now getting closer to the truth. After piecing everything together, historians have come up with a single conclusion. Aoife held her breath. The event was all due to what appears to be a case of body possession. As if two invisible hands were gripping down her throat, Aoife found herself slowly starting to suffocate, her words starting to slur as her mouth grew dry. Kira's words rang in her mind again, and she felt her heart pause. It can't be, right? Swallowing her saliva, she continued to read. Even though she didn't want to, she had to read. There was still one last bit of text. Just a little. The general symptoms of body possession are pale expression, unfocused eyes, behavioral changes, and in least common cases, loss of taste. Sweet foods become too sweet and salty foods become too bland. Aoife stopped herself mid-sentence, her expression gradually changing as a face appeared in her mind. This. She let go of the book, moving back and staring at it with an incredulous look. The last words continued to ring in her mind, over and over again, as if whispering in her ears, and as her eyes traced those words again, Aoife felt her heart stop. No, it's not possible. It can't be. Chapter 320. The second round 3. Aoife stood in shock, her mouth hanging open as she found herself staring at the book in front of her with widened eyes. Which one? He's changed about 5 times. In the least common cases, loss of taste. Sweet foods become too sweet and salty foods become too bland. Voices of the past whispered in her mind as she stood in silence, her face continuously shifting as she tried to make sense of all the information that she had. It can't be possible, right? And yet, everything pointed out this fact. From her past research on how Julian was different than he was now, to Evelyn's words, and the words that she read from the book. As if the pieces of the puzzle slowly started to set, Aoife came to a slow and chilling realization. Julian, she took a deep breath. He might not be the real one. The thoughts sent her into a daze, sending her mind into a state of blankness as she swallowed her saliva and tried to make the best sense of her realization. When did all of this start? Halfway through the academy or before? Aoife sorted through her memorization. In the end, she found her answer. Before the academy. With him being the son of a barony, she didn't know much about him. The only thing she knew about him was the fact that he had suddenly become the Black Star, and later in the cooking class he added a worrying amount of salt to his food. A lot of things started to make sense in Aoife's mind as she felt her lips quiver. No, it's not decided. Aoife took a deep breath and sat down on the table. Carefully reading through the words, she pursed her lips. This might not necessarily mean that Julian is possessed. His changes can be explained by how Evelyn said that his personality switched 5 times in the past. Aoife bit her lips. What was there to say that those personality changes weren't related to his possession? More excuses started to pour down. His taste bud situation could be something that he's inherently born with. If it is, then it's highly likely that I'm overthinking this, right? Aoife slapped her fist over her palm. I might be jumping to conclusions. I'll ask Evelyn later. Though Aoife acted like this, She was in reality just trying to make excuses for herself. At heart, she knew the answer that Evelyn would give her, and the thought made her scared. If Julian was really possessed, what was she supposed to do? Leave him be? But as the princess, how could she let him be? What if he harbored thoughts against their empire? Then she would have no choice but to act. It was just that he had helped her in the past and she felt indebted to him. But what if he had done that to purposely get close to her? What if he was just trying to manipulate her? Who? Aoife took a deep breath and slapped the sides of her cheeks. Now is not the time to think about this. She had rather mixed feelings about the situation, but other things were far more pressing, such as Kira's situation. That was not something that could have been delayed. Immediately, she thought about contacting her family to have Kira detained, but found herself stopping halfway through. No, that's not feasible. Kira's family was rather high up in the noble circle. Furthermore, they were also a member of Central, the collective of noble houses. Detaining Kira would hold severe implications. That was unless she was able to provide enough evidence of the situation. And that she didn't have. The only thing that she had was the text that she had received from her before her disappearance. That was far from enough. I could also have her checked for possession, but that would take time. Finding if someone was possessed was not that difficult. A specific cleric, a person specialized in the curse element, was usually called up for this. They would usually cast several spells in order to identify if someone was possessed or not. The only problem was that it would take at least a couple of days to arrive. Would that be enough? Aoife bit her lips. Recalling the text that she had reasoned, she found herself wanting to shake her head. However, she still nonetheless took out her communication device and sent a message to one of her servants to tell them to call a cleric to come. Regardless, I should do it. If they came early, it was good. If not, then it wouldn't matter since she wasn't stopping here. As Aoife shifted her attention back to the book in front of her, she had a sudden thought as her hand froze. Wait! Aoife frowned while looking back at her communication device. That was when she realized something. In her haste, she had forgotten one of the most important things. And that was the fact that the angel knew that she knew. In that case, Aoife's head flicked and looked toward her back. Her heart beat out of her throat while the surroundings turned extremely quiet. Seated at one of the wooden tables, surrounded by towering shelves of books and with hardly anyone in sight, Aoife suddenly felt the silence pressing in on her as if the very walls were closing in, watching her every move. Feeling the beat of her own heart, Aoife secretly swallowed before slowly turning her head back to face the back. But as she did, two glaring red eyes met her gaze. A pale figure sat across from her, her expression unnervingly calm. A simple smile curving her lips as she watched Aoife in silence. Hi! Aoife held her breath. As she stared at the figure before her, every hair on her body stood on end, and she found herself unable to breathe. A suffocating sensation overtook her body. Despite her overwhelming panic, she remained level-headed. Looking at the familiar, and yet unfamiliar figure before her, Aoife's mind raced. How do I call my guards? As the princess of the empire, the moment that she reached the capital, her family designated 2 guards to protect her. They stood in the shadows and watched her at all times. It was for that reason that she usually wasn't worried about her safety. But things were different now. Kira was someone that her guards knew about. They weren't monitoring her closely. And the problem with her was the fact that she could attack without being seen. Drip. Her sweat dripped down on the side of the table as she closed her fists slowly. The sight of her made the angel smile, her voice rising to an eerie, childlike pitch. There's no need to be so nervous, hi hi hi. Her giggles, innocent and filled with joy, sent chills down Aoife's spine, intensifying the dread that gripped her as her mind raced to make sense of the situation. All sorts of thoughts ran through her mind, but before she could do so, Aoife felt her entire body freeze. Before she could understand what had happened, her head slowly turned and her gaze met with the angel's. Stop resisting. It'll all be over before you realize it. That was when Aoife felt the world grow dark, and her thoughts disappear. What is up with your timing? Is it your intuition thing again? That nonsense. Leon pursed his lips, looking down at the floor that was pooled over with the liquid he spilled. He then raised his head and shook his head. I was really just here to have a drink. He pointed toward a nearby shop. I heard it was good, so I wanted to try it. I didn't expect to see you here. He bit his lips, trying his best to keep his face straight. I felt my left brow twitch at the sight, but just managed to stop myself before telling him the truth. It was Caius. Only then did Leon's expression return to normal. Caius? Yes, the same one that we're thinking about. What did he want? He was insecure about his emotive abilities. Oh. Leon made a strange face. He struggled to understand my words. But was it really that hard to get? It was pretty straightforward in my opinion. He's the same guy that took my role in the play. Really? Yes, I'm pretty confident. Huh. Leon's eyes squinted. Then, as if piecing everything together, he slowly nodded his head. He's insecure. I told you so. It really wasn't that hard to get. But was that the only reason that he visited you? Maybe. I wasn't quite sure, to be honest. This was the first time that I had truly noticed and interacted with him. I didn't really know what to make out of our conversation. Could be because I defeated 2 from his empire? Oh yeah. Leon tossed the drink in his hand. There wasn't much left and he didn't seem too keen on finishing it. He was just about to leave when his expression stiffened and his body shook. What? What's up with this guy again? I was just about to get annoyed when his expression turned extremely serious. He looked toward a certain direction and then looked back at me. Something happened. Your intuition? Yes. Leon didn't deny it and sped forward. I stood in place for a brief moment before following from behind. We hurried through Grimspire, running through the cobblestone streets until we reached the separation point, situated at the center of a dome-shaped building. Tall, fluted columns lined the exterior, supporting a grand portico that provided entry into the building where the mirror crack was visible. I was just about to enter when Leon raised his hand to stop me. Wait here. Something is coming. At the same time, he pushed us into a more secluded area. Though confused, I didn't say anything and just waited as he said. I didn't know for how long we stood for. However, with the heat, it started to feel rather uncomfortable. But soon, 2 figures appeared. Walking out from the separation point, they looked extremely normal. With Aoife carrying several books with her, and Kira walking behind her with a frown, I turned to look at Leon. That was when I noticed the grim, almost terrifying expression on his face. What? Something is wrong. Leon quietly murmured as his expression forcefully relaxed. Then, as if he knew exactly what to do, he turned around and took out his communication device. Who are you calling? Leon glanced at me for a brief moment before answering. Someone who knows how to deal with the situation best. Situation? I once again glanced in Kira's and Aoife's direction. Though I was confused, I didn't question his intuition and just asked, Evelyn. He pursed his lips. This isn't the first time she has dealt with something like this. Chapter 321. The second round. 4. Isn't the first time that she has dealt with this? Leon's words added another layer to the confusion that I already felt. What was he talking about? And how was that related to Aoife and Kira? I know you're confused, but I'll explain everything later. All right? As Leon placed the communication device into his pocket, his expression continued to appear solemn. He stood in the same spot for a few seconds, seemingly trying to understand what to do next before he started to move. I walked in silence, following him without asking many questions. I knew I'd get answers soon enough. At the same, I interpreted the entire situation inside of my mind with whatever little information that I had in mind. Soon, we arrived in front of a small inn, where a slender figure was waiting for us. With long purple locks and dressed in the standard Blackhaven Academy uniform, she leaned casually against the side of the building. When she noticed our approach, her expression brightened momentarily, but it quickly faded when she caught sight of me. Her expression stiffened when she saw me, and I touched my face. I wasn't that scary, was I? Looks like you've received my message. I did, Evelyn tacitly replied, her eyes darting in my direction before she waved her hand slightly and murmured, Hi. It was clear that she was always quite reserved around me. I had noticed it for a long time. There was an invisible wall between us that made it difficult to connect with her. Whenever I tried to engage in conversation, she would respond, but that was as far as our interactions went. In reality, she seemed to want to purposely keep her distance from me. And I was fine with that to some extent. As long as it doesn't increase the calamity bar. Tilting her head up, Evelyn brushed her purple locks behind her ears before asking, So? What did you want to talk Abu? There's something strange with Kira and Aoife. The confusion on Evelyn's face became apparent. Before she could voice her worries, Leon continued, It's highly like that they've been influenced by something, and I think you're the one who is best suited for figuring the situation out. Since. Leon stopped, glancing my way for a brief moment. Evelyn stood in silence, coming to an understanding as her eyes widened. Judging from her expression, she understood the implications of his words, her expression tightening considerably. However, she quickly composed herself, taking a deep breath to regain her composure. Who? Pursing her lips, she stared at Leon. How sure are you of this? I'm quite sure. I noticed an abnormality with Kira back in the tournament, but I didn't think much about it until my intuition brought me to her. Kira? No, Aoife, Leon replied in a serious tone. My intuition only brought me to her, But the moment I got close to them, I felt the same thing from them. Danger. Leon shook his head. Madness. Ugh. Evelyn quietly stared at Leon for a few moments, as if trying to peer into his eyes and discern whether he was lying. I couldn't tell what she saw, but eventually, she nodded and cast a fleeting glance in my direction. I didn't pay much attention to her actions. In fact, I hadn't paid much attention to anything. From the moment Leon revealed the situation, my mind raced as I thought of a possibility. Could it be? The angel. I had always wondered why things had been so quiet since the angel attempted to influence me back at the plaza. At the time, I believed I had somehow managed to resist its influence, at least for a short while, and since then I'd kept my guard up. I thought it'd try to reach for me again, especially since in the vision I had been the only one present. But I was wrong. The angel, it changed targets. It directly went ahead and influenced Kira. And now, Aoife. No, were the two of them the only ones that were influenced? Could there be more? The thought sent a chill down my spine as I looked at Leon and Evelyn. That, I spoke, gathering their attention toward me. I think I might have an idea of what's going on. That was when I explained to them about the statue and how it had tried to influence my mind back in the plaza. I told them how I didn't think much back then but felt like it was important. I didn't mention anything about my foresight ability. I felt like Leon would figure something out if I were to tell him about it. I wouldn't know how he'd react, especially since he seemed to disdain these gods. As I spoke, Leon and Evelyn listened quietly. It didn't take long for me to explain the entire situation to them, and the two fell silent shortly after, seemingly digesting my words. In the end, Leon was the first one to speak. So you think it's related to this statue? Yes. Leon pursed his lips and glanced at Evelyn, who was staring at me with an unreadable expression. It wasn't until Leon coughed that she snapped out of it. Cough. Yes. Leon didn't know how to react when he saw her this flustered. He gave her a moment to compose herself before explaining the situation. She seemed to have taken it all in and nodded in understanding. It does seem a little suspicious. Can you go to the Royal Library to check for information? The Royal Library? I think I can do that. I should still have a pass. Good. With a serious nod, Evelyn turned and hurried away. Given the limited time before the second round began, she needed to act quickly. Of the three of us, she was the only one with access to the Royal Library. She was the only one with a high enough noble rank to access it without special permission. As a noble, I also had the potential to visit the library, but I required permission from Julian's father, whom I had yet to contact. I had my reservations when interacting with Julian's old family. Nonetheless, I still tried to get permission, but it brought no luck. I didn't get a reply. It only made me grow more wary about Julian's relationship with his father. I feel like it'll give me a headache further down the line. I could only lament my luck. In the end, with no access to the Royal Library, I could only go look for information elsewhere. There was a public library, but that didn't have much information with regard to what we wanted to know. I knew because I tried finding information right after the vision. The information I found was far too vague to make anything with it. Tisk. Clicking my tongue, I recalled something and looked in the direction of where Evelyn went. What's wrong? I pursed my lips, recalling Aoife and Kira as they left the separation point. In particular, the books that Aoife was holding. I'm not sure she'll find much. The morning passed, and the afternoon came. It was now the time for the second round of combats to start. The location of the second round was the same as the first. In the center of the plaza, the grand, imposing statue stood tall, while the platforms floated above, supported by chains that held them in place and caused them to tilt slightly from time to time. Delilah sat in one of the balconies that granted her a view of the entire plaza from above, including the platforms that were suspended in the air. Opposite her was Atlas, who had arrived earlier. Their seats were reserved as delegates from Haven. And despite Atlas's position, he preferred to sit here, stating, "It's a little too loud over there. I'm better off here." Delilah paid him no mind and placed a book on the table. It was a purple book that had a small paper cover that blocked the cover of the book. With a Delilah read the book. Flip. She casually flipped through the pages, her dark eyes gliding from one page to the other. Her actions drew the attention of Atlas, who quietly set his teacup down. It was the first time he had seen Delilah so absorbed in reading. She was usually indifferent to such things. Pursing his lips, he grew a little curious. What sort of book is she reading? She looked rather engrossed in it. He also noticed a small book by the side as she took notes from time to time. Interesting. Is the book that you're reading interesting? Delilah raised her head, taking her attention away from the book. Her eyes briefly fluttered with a flicker of acknowledgement before she returned her focus to the pages. So, it was neither interesting nor boring to her. She was just reading it to better understand a few things that she wasn't aware of. So? Atlas blinked his eyes for a brief moment before smiling and losing interest. What other response did he expect from her? Regardless, there was something he was more interested in. Looks like we're about to start. Lowering his head to stare at the plaza, which was filling with familiar figures, he propped his chin up while fixing his attention on a couple of figures. In particular, a young man with short black hair and hazel eyes. The sight of him made his lips curl. You've done well so far. Julian's matches may not have been the most eye-catching, given the injuries he sustained and the time it took for him to defeat his opponents, but it also had to be noted that the opponents he fought against were bad matchups, all of which were designed to attack his weaknesses. And yet, he still came out on top. This was what impressed Atlas the most. And when he thought back to the past, to the first time he saw Julian, he couldn't help but feel the corner of his lips pull slightly. Right, he's grown a lot. He was known as the weakest Black Star back then. But now? That was no longer the case. Though he no longer was the Black Star, Atlas believed he'd be able to get the title back if he wanted to. In the case he did, Atlas knew he would no longer be referred to with that name. Though he'd also not be called the strongest Black Star. That title belonged to someone else. Atlas's eyes turned to face Delilah, who was still engrossed in her book. It was just a fleeting glance, but as Atlas turned his head to look at Delilah, he noticed that the cover protecting the book was slipping slightly, revealing a glimpse of the title. Squinting his eyes, Atlas took a peek, his expression gradually turning strange. How to Seduce. Chapter 322. The second round, 5. Tensions ran high as the contestants began to gather at the plaza. 4 distinct groups formed, each one representing the remaining members of the 4 empires. Verdant Empire Quarter. Amel silently stared at the Naz and Sifa's group. The moment he caught sight of a certain figure, his entire body shook slightly. How come I've never noticed him before? It was hard to not notice him. With his appearance, coupled with the attention he was receiving, it was obvious to Amel that he was someone with a reasonably high status. Perhaps he wasn't a noble, but he was at least respected. Amel clenched his teeth. Could it really be him? The more he looked at Leon, the more he noticed the resemblances to his father. It might have been his imagination, but the thought lingered, refusing to leave his mind. It got to the point where it started to eat at his mind. Amel, it was only when someone from his group called for him that he snapped out of it. Yes? He glanced down to see a young man with green eyes and black hair, standing a head shorter than Amel. He wore the standard Verdant Empire uniform, a green blazer adorned with golden embroidery and the Empire's insignia, the ancient turtle of Barilon. With Agatha eliminated, this young man was now the second most powerful person in the group. Charles looked at Amel. He had been acting rather weird ever since he had come to the plaza. While he was usually indifferent to everything around him, he still took the lead when the time came. But right now, he was out of it. His attention had been fixed toward the other groups, never paying any attention to them. Why did you call me? Hearing Amel's sharp words, Charles pursed his lips before pointing behind him. Our situation isn't good. He spoke honestly. Of all the other groups, we've lost the second in command, and while we used to have the most people, we now have the least amount. Charles shifted his attention toward the other groups, his gaze locking onto the members of the Naz and Sifa Empire and the Aurora Empire. He was shocked to see how many people they had. The Naz and Sifa and Aurora Empires both have the most remaining participants, and not by a small margin. It's a little embarrassing. What does that matter? Amel asked while frowning. So long as I reach the top spot, this will be a trivial matter. That? Charles wasn't sure how to put it into words, but it all boiled down to the fact that this event was being streamed across all 4 empires. Even if they managed to secure a victory with Amel winning, it would only prove that they had the best talent. Beyond that, though, what were they? A one-man team? It wasn't a good look for them, especially since an empire wasn't run by a single person but by many. This was beyond embarrassing. Don't worry. Not noticing his worries, and perhaps not caring for them, Amel patted him on the shoulder. It's true that we've lost Agatha, and we've got the least number of participants. His attention shifted back toward a certain individual. He stood with a stoic face, looking around and not speaking much. But it's not like we lack talents. The broadcast began with Carl and Johanna seated side by side, staring at the recording device aimed at them. As they introduced the next round, clips of the previous fights began to replay on the screen, allowing everyone to relive the action. Carl began the broadcast. By the twist, he was referring to the last fight, the one involving Kira and Agatha. Following their fights, a lot of interest fell on Kira as many started to inquire about her. Coupled with the fact that she was a beauty, she also started to gain a certain following. Carl teased the audience as he pressed down on the table. After much thought and deliberation, we've updated the power ranking for the remaining competitors, based on their previous performances and the information we have available. These rankings reflect who we believe has the strongest chance of winning the competition. A table with a list of names appeared for all to see. Sadface power ranking. 1 Caius Etheria. 2 Amel Mantovech. 3 Kalian Mandrel. 4 Aoife Megrail. 5 Leon Ellert. 6 Kira Milne. 7 James Bergham. 8 Charles Darlot. 9 Julian Ivinus. 10 Clora Yillow. Sadface power ranking. The list stopped at the 10th spot. As you all noticed, there's not much of a gap between the top 4, but there's been a massive shift in everything beneath that. It's surprising how many talents have emerged from the Nuz and Sifa Empire. In particular, Kira Milne, who seemingly appeared from out of nowhere. Kira not only gained more followers following her success, but her power ranking rose dramatically as a result. To be able to defeat someone as powerful as Agatha, one would without a doubt need to be powerful, and Kira proved her capabilities. Everything else remained relatively similar to how it had been in the past, except one other name. Julian has also made a significant rise, moving from 30th place all the way to 9th. While he's not yet one of the top favorites to win, he's closing in on that position. After all, we still haven't seen his true specialty in action. Following those words, Carl went on to ramble about the other contestants, giving the audience a little overview of everyone present until Johanna stopped him. Her words brought an immediate silence to the studio as everyone focused their attention on the platforms that hung suspended in the air. Figures started to emerge one after another, and soon enough, each platform contained 2 contestants. With a smile, Carl spoke. After pressing the cube, I was transported to the top of a familiar platform. The air was dry, and the relentless heat from the sun felt uncomfortably intense. To my right, the referee stood with an impassive expression while opposite me a figure appeared. I don't recognize her. With long brown hair and brown eyes, she had a rather plain appearance. Freckles marred her features while her small nose squinted slightly. Dressed in the attire of the Verdant Empire, she tensed the moment she saw me, but quickly took a deep breath and assumed her position. I did so as well. The surroundings fell silent as we stared at each other from our end. Julian Ivinus of the Nuz and Sifa Empire versus Veronica Chandler of the Verdant Empire. It was only when the referee spoke that she moved. Begin. Crack. The ground beneath her feet cracked and shattered, propelling her forward with explosive force. She shot toward me like a bullet. Having watched her previous fights, I was somewhat familiar with her style, but I was still curious. As far as I saw, she's not a body-type user. She should be more of an elemental mage with her element being ice. The fact that she broke the ground beneath her showed that she had already reached the 4th tier. Extending my hand forward, I prepared to use Grip of Pestilence, when she pressed her foot forward and came to a sudden stop. Then, before I even had a chance to understand what she was trying to do, her body sank into the pavement. Oh! I stood stunned for a second. This was the first time I had seen her do this, and was taken aback somewhat. I instinctively looked downward where 2 hands emerged, trying to grip my ankles. Not this again. The sight of the hands made my body shudder as I was reminded of a scene from the past. Without hesitation, I kicked off the ground and leaped into the air to avoid her attack. However, as if she anticipated my move, her body shot up rapidly from the ground in an attempt to grab me. Since I was airborne and unable to stop, I couldn't activate Step of Suppression. Nonetheless, I brought my hand down with decisive force. In a matter of a second, my entire hand turned purple as I pressed down to grab her face. Her eyes widened at the sight of my hand, but it was too late. Unable to adjust her attack in time, she clenched her teeth and pressed forward. Steam began to rise from her hands and mouth as ice started to form around her hand. The temperature dropped significantly, and my heart squeezed for a brief moment. In that brief instant, just as our hands were about to connect, I extended my left hand, sending a thread shooting toward the ground at an angle. Using the little force provided, I twisted my body midair. Before she could react, my hand pressed against the back of her head. Gripping her face tightly with one hand, I flicked my head to look around me before pressing my finger from my other hand against her temple. A voice fell shortly after that. Match over. The winner is... Thump. The both of us landed on the ground. Julian Ivinus of the Nuz and Sifa Empire. Who? Following the announcement, I let go of my opponent's head and stood up. I had been a little nervous at first considering how hard my first 2 matches had been. However, things went a lot smoother than I had anticipated. This is the first time a fight went so smoothly for me. Didn't have to almost die for once. In the previous matches, I found myself struggling quite a lot, sustaining quite a lot of injuries at the same time. This match felt like a breath of fresh air. As the cube materialized in front of me, I clenched it tightly and reappeared beneath the platforms. Being one of the first to arrive, I looked around and my gaze immediately fixed on the Statue of Liberty. Despite its worn appearance, my heart raced at the sight of it towering above me. There was something about the statue that made me feel oppressed, as if it were challenging my sanity. Was this really a game world? Or a remnant of what Earth used to be? The thought weighed heavily on my mind, and as I pursed my lips and looked away, another figure appeared beside me. "You're done." Leon looked at me up and down before showing a surprised look. "And you're uninjured? What's surprising about that?" I frowned. It felt as though he expected me to be injured. "I got an easier matchup." "Oh, I guess that's possible." Leon scratched the back of his head before taking out the tablet that displayed the broadcast and passed it on to me. "Wanna have a look?" "Sure." There was nothing else to do, and I wanted to see how the other matches played out. We had just turned on the stream when I felt my expression pause. Leon's reaction was the same as he watched the ongoing match. On either end stood two figures we knew all too well, one with red hair and the other with purple. As their hair fluttered slightly, the two began to move. That's when I turned to look at the side of the tablet. Platform 3, Aoife Megrail vs. Evelyn Verlice. Chapter 323. Cleric 1. Evelyn found her opponent to be unexpected. "Oh, this?" Seeing Aoife stand opposite her, Evelyn found herself silently biting her lips. She had just returned from the library looking for any information but was disappointed to have found nothing. When asked, she was told that the books had already been taken. Because the books were classified as scholarly books, there weren't many copies around. There were a few, but all of them had been taken. When Evelyn checked to see who the last one to have signed up for the book was, she was surprised to see that it was Aoife. Is something really wrong with her? Despite the referee announcing the match's start, neither of the two moved. All Evelyn could see were two fiery locks of hair and a pair of gleaming yellow eyes that stood out starkly against the bright white sun hanging overhead. "Are you not going to attack?" Startling her out of her thoughts was Aoife, who poised herself like she normally did. It was unfortunate that she didn't know her all too well, otherwise she would have been able to tell better. But is this really the case? Evelyn bitterly smiled when she recalled a certain figure. With him, she always struggled to tell if he had changed or not. He would change so often that she now struggled to understand whether he had really changed or not. It was something that still affected her to this day. But after observing Julian for as long as she did, she was now confident that he had truly changed again. The thought made her thoughts complicated, but she didn't have much time to think about such situations. Lifting her head, she looked at Aoife. She was looking at her with a simple smile, seemingly waiting for her to act. Evelyn didn't leave her hanging for long. As she pressed her finger forward, a small purple magic circle appeared. It formed with such speed that it was almost impossible for the naked eye to catch. Upon its completion, a purple streak tore the air and headed straight for Aoife, who tilted her head. Boom! A second later, a thunderous boom echoed through the air, shaking the ground beneath them. Aoife's hair fluttered gently as she looked back. That was close. Though she said that, she still managed to avoid it. Evelyn didn't appear disheartened as she pressed the air again. This time, she did so in multiple succession. Aoife's eyes dilated the moment Evelyn moved, and in the next second, her entire body trembled as she rushed forward, twisting her body in all sorts of ways. Boom, boom, boom. The platform trembled under the force of Evelyn's relentless assaults, each strike making the air sizzle and crackle with power. Though Evelyn's attacks were swift and precise, Aoife seemed to be able to see the future, dodging everything by a hair's length. With every narrow miss, she edged closer to Evelyn, her movements as graceful as they could be. Evelyn's rhythm remained steady, her fingers tapping out a precise pattern as she maintained her barrage. Tap, tap, tap. Evelyn's consistent rhythm, though powerful, became predictable to Aoife. With each step, Aoife grew more confident, her focus sharpening as she closed the gap. Within a few breaths, she was only a few meters away from Evelyn, whose composed exterior began to crack, revealing the first hints of fluster and uncertainty. As Aoife took another step forward, Evelyn tapped the air once more, or at least made it look like she did as she paused her finger. Caught off guard, Aoife moved in advance. It was then that she realized all of this had been a setup. But the realization came too late as Evelyn pressed down with her finger. Boom! Aoife was struck directly, her head recoiling back as she stumbled back several steps. How could Evelyn give her a chance to recuperate? With the opening now presented to Evelyn, she dashed forward, her eyes crackling as faint bolts of lightning curled out of her eyes. Boom! With another roar, her body faded, appearing right in front of the distracted Aoife. Moving her shoulder down, Evelyn pressed her hand toward Aoife's abdomen, where another magic circle formed. Cracka! A massive magic circle formed above them, hanging over her head with a dense flow of mana. Lightning crackled within it, gathering power as it prepared to strike down with a terrifying force. Cracka, cracka. The charged energy hummed in the air, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the platform, and the tension escalated as the power continued to gather. Aoife, who was still recovering from the shock of Evelyn's previous attack, barely had time to react as she looked up. Despite the situation she was in, her face remained calm. Casting a look in Evelyn's direction, she flicked her hand up. Eh? Evelyn's body shot above her, in the direction of the looming lightning. It was a good thing that Evelyn's control over the lightning was strong. The moment she realized what had happened, her expression changed and her teeth clenched. Clasping her hands together, the lighting shattered before it could fully materialize and she twisted her body midair, landing on the ground safely. Thud. Ha! Ha! With heavy breaths, she looked at the otherwise normal Aoife. Unlike her, she didn't seem to have used much energy at all as her complexion was still rosy and her breath was ragged. Evelyn raised her hand, prepared to attack again when Aoife raised her hand in a stopping motion. Evelyn felt her entire body stop. Evelyn's body froze as if an invisible force had wrapped around her, locking her in place. Aware of Aoife's powers, bolts formed around Evelyn, jolting her body out of Aoife's control. Evelyn immediately followed up by raising her hand, a magic circle forming on the top of her palm in preparation for a counterattack. But how would Aoife let her? Scatter that. Aoife flicked her hand to the left and Evelyn's hand flung in the same way. Uck! As Evelyn's body was carried in the direction her arm had been flung, Aoife stepped forward. With a swift movement, Aoife flicked her other hand in the opposite direction. The sudden force caused Evelyn to feel her other arm being pulled the other way, resulting in her arms crossing in an awkward and disorienting manner. Yuck! Even Lynn felt an immediate sense of pain. However, before she could even have the chance to retaliate, Aoife flicked her hands down, and Evelyn's face came smacking against the pavement beneath. Thud! The blow stunned her. For a brief second, she blacked out. By the time she recovered, her eyes flared open as she realized the situation she was in. Flicking her head up, she noticed a shadow looking down on her from above, and without much thought, she jolted her mind awake and pushed herself up. Thud. Or at least tried to. A powerful force weighed down on her the moment she tried to move up. Yuck! Regardless of how much she tried to struggle, her body remained planted against the ground. Whenever she tried to move one hand, it'd straighten and stop her from helping herself up. She struggled like this for several seconds before her entire body was left paralyzed. Her struggle was useless. Gradually, she felt her body being lifted from the ground, rising steadily until her eyes locked with Aoife's. It was a good fight, was what she said. Everything that came after that was a blur as Aoife pressed her hand against her forehead and she blacked out. The winner is. The last thing Evelyn heard was the referee's voice. Aoife Megrail of the Nuz and Sifa Empire. The results were as expected, but Evelyn put on a wonderful performance. It appears as though this is the golden age of the Nuz and Sifa Empire. If not for the fact that she had been matched up against Aoife, Evelyn would have certainly been another dark horse. As Carl sighed with disappointment, he turned to look at Johanna, who was staring intently at the broadcast. Her eyes were set on Aoife, who carefully handed Evelyn's body to the referee before smiling and waving at the camera. Her actions were probably meant for the audience. Shifting her attention back to the broadcast, Johanna went on to explain the details of the match. As she did, her mind couldn't help but wander back to the match. In the last moments, she felt that Evelyn could have been able to turn the match around. Or at least, she felt that Evelyn had all the means to not lose the way that she did. In particular, the last moments when her body was locked against the ground. Had Evelyn used her powers, she would have been able to free herself from Aoife's telekinesis. There was also the time when Aoife flung her in the air. That could have also been prevented had she been more careful. There were a few instances where Johanna felt that she could have turned things in her favor. And yet, she didn't. Could it be inexperience? Or was she perhaps nervous? With how many mistakes she made, it almost felt as though she wanted to lose. But was that truly the case? Johanna wasn't sure, and the thought bothered her a little. Could it be that because Aoife is the princess she purposely lost? It wouldn't surprise me if that's the case. The Nuz and Sifa Empire is known to do such things. In the end, however, she had a job to do. And so, she could only throw those thoughts toward the back of her mind as she continued to explain all the details of the match. As you can see, the turning point was this moment. Right when Evelyn's body was lifted off the ground, the darkness felt suffocating. Embracing her body like a heavy cloak, Evelyn felt her entire body grow cold. She looked around her, scanning the darkness that had taken hold of her body, and pursed her lips. Turning toward a certain direction, her eyes fell on a certain statue. It stood in the darkness, half of its body masked and embraced by it. It was a chilling sight that would send chills down anyone's spine. And yet, so they were right, Evelyn murmured to herself as she closed her eyes. Aoife and Kira were really possessed by someone. When she opened her eyes again, the statue was only a few inches away from her. Its nose a few inches away from her as black tears fell down its eyes. Evelyn stared at the statue without much emotion as her lips parted. I've been waiting. Chapter 324. Cleric 2. Evelyn stood frozen. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the statue standing before her. Its lifeless eyes seemed to bore into her soul, their blurred gaze filled with emptiness. As she stepped closer, the faint cracks along its nose became more pronounced, and the black streaks that lined its cheeks seeped into the statue's face, highlighting its sorrow. The air around her grew colder and the silence felt deafening. Despite the situation she was in, Evelyn was able to remain calm. As the darkness embraced the two of them, Evelyn extended her hand, a purple magic circle floating on top of it as it started to rotate. I've once met with a cleric. In the silence, she started to speak while the statue stood still, silently staring at her without moving at all. Could it even move? There was this person that I knew that started to become different. His entire personality just did a 180 all of a sudden. At first, I had been told that this was something that young males go through. Puberty, as they said. But the circle spun with increasing speed, the runes atop it blurring as the color deepened into a darker shade. Could a young man in puberty really change so much? Almost as if he was an entirely different person. Not only that, but so many times as that. Evelyn scoffed. I may have been young, but I wasn't stupid. There was something fundamentally wrong with him. I thought he was sick, but he wasn't. The magic circle whirled at an even more frantic pace, lightning crackling around it, with bolts of electricity orbiting the circle in erratic bursts. Such action caused the surrounding darkness to shake, the area surrounding the magic circle fluctuating slightly. In spite of all of what was happening around her, Evelyn's expression remained even, tightening as her jaw clenched. He was possessed. She spat through her clenched teeth. At least that was what I thought. He'd change back each time, return back to his usual self. That's what made it hard to tell, and what made others dismiss this possibility. But I still believed it. And for that reason, I asked the cleric to teach me something. Evelyn could still recall that day. She had only been about 15 years old. It was about the time when she was first allowed to start practicing her mana. Seeing the cleric, a tall man in dark robes marked with a red cross in the center, leaving the Ivinus residence while shaking his head and insisting he wasn't possessed, Evelyn desperately begged him to teach her something. To teach her in the off-change he turned again. At first, the cleric was hesitant, saying things like, "You're too young. He's not possessed. There's no point. You're wasting your time," and so on. But she persisted, and in the end, in the name of the Verlice household, he taught her something. It was a single spell meant for self-defense, but it was enough. Sparks erupted from the magic circle floating in Evelyn's hand, crackling with unstable energy. As she felt the power draining from her body, she directed her trembling hand toward the statue. But as she did, the statue finally showed signs of moving. CR crack. A sharp crack echoed through the air as a fine line formed around its neck. Evelyn froze, her breath hitching as the statue began to rumble. Instinctively, she reached out to press her hand against it. But before she could make contact, the statue's head jerked, snapping around 180 degrees with a sickening crunch. Crack. Where the old face had been, a new one now stared back at her. A face she recognized all too well. Evelyn's hand hovered in midair, her heart pounding as a cold dread seized her. Before Evelyn could react, another sharp crack split the air. The statue's head jerked 90 degrees, revealing yet another face beneath the fractured surface. Sealed into the stone, staring blankly back at her, was Aoife's face. The lifeless eyes and the cold, rigid expression sent a wave of horror crashing over Evelyn, her breath pausing. Flick. The statue's head flicked again. A new face appeared. Josephine. Flick. Flicked once more. Each time, a new face appeared. Flick. Flick. In rapid succession, the statue's head jerked and twisted, its neck contorting with horrifying speed. Each flick revealed a new face, more and more familiar to Evelyn. Evelyn stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing and her body tense as the nightmarish display unfolded before her. The more she looked, the more she realized something. They all belonged to people from the Ar Empire and Aurora Empire. She could hardly see a figure from the other two empires. Was this a coincidence? A scheme orchestrated by the other empires? No, that might not be it. Evelyn's thoughts ran wild. It then soon hit her. Right, it's that. There was only one possible explanation for all of this, and it dawned on her rather quickly. The angel, it targeted those who had the weakest minds. And in this case, the ones who had the weakest mind were obvious. It was those who came back from the strange cult incident a while back. Their empire and the Aurora Empire. While many did not show it, and the empires tried to help everyone who was involved, the lasting damages from the incident were still lingering fresh in the minds of many. Dying multiple times wasn't something that just anyone could take. It haunted them in secret, and through that, the angel was able to exploit their weakness and enter their minds. The realization hit Evelyn quickly. A lot of things started to make sense to her at that moment as her shoulder jerked and she thrust her hand forward. But as she did, the angel came to life. The statue's neck stopped on a specific face, its features now locked in a small grin. The darkness around it seemed to pulse and writhe, swallowing the statue whole. Crack. With a sudden, piercing crack, the statue vanished, dissolving into the shadows as if countless dark hands had emerged to drag it back into the darkness. That was when Evelyn's hand came forward. Cracka. In the exact spot, chains made out of lighting bore down, chaining down the empty space before her. Feeling her attack miss, Evelyn turned around to see the angel appear, its arms no longer cupped together in a begging motion, but outstretched to grasp her neck. It only came to a stop the moment that Evelyn's eyes fell on it. She felt her entire body grow tense as she noticed the angel's figure starting to fade once more, the hands reaching out for it and pulling it back into the darkness. By the time it disappeared, Evelyn felt her heart beating at her throat as the back of her neck tingled. Her head turned and a hand clasped her throat. Yook! Evelyn's pupils constricted. In a moment of crisis, she propped her hand up and clenched her fist. The lighting chains that coiled behind her shot in the angel's direction. The chains moved quickly. Before the angel could even disappear like before, the chains grasped it, coiling around its arms and body, and sealing its movements. The darkness that embraced its body started to fade, revealing the entire frame of the statue as it stared back at her, its tears following down its cheeks. Cough! Evelyn's lungs were on fire as she coughed once and light returned to her eyes. When she came to, she realized that she was lying on top of an unfamiliar bed. She looked around to see that it was the nursery. I'm free. Despite being free, she was still tense. Looking around, she took out her communication device and prepared to message Leon about the situation when she stopped. No, this isn't the right decision. Though the angel was currently sealed within her body, there was no guarantee that it couldn't see her actions. The angel had eyes and ears everywhere. Not only that, but it was probably going to target her. Yook! Holding onto her chest, she moved out of the bed and put her clothes on. At the same time, she put the communication device away. As things stood, she needed to find a different way to relay the information she found. A way that wouldn't let the angel be aware of who was involved. Only that way would they be able to solve the situation. Following Evelyn's defeat, Aoife came back down to the plaza, acting like she normally did. At first glance, she didn't seem to be off. But the more Leon looked at her, the more he felt that something was off. Aoife, she was abnormally calm. Too calm. In a situation such as this, she would have normally shown a little bit of regret. Congratulations on your win. As if noticing his stare, Aoife went to greet him. Leon quickly snapped out of it and answered her back with a smile. Thank you. You were great as well. Thank you. He couldn't show her that he felt that something was off about her. For that reason, after a few seconds, he bitterly smiled while scratching the back of his head. Although, I do feel a little bad for Evelyn. Ah! Aoife showed a look of realization before lowering her head. I'm sorry, but you know I had to. Yeah, you two had a great fight. You've gotten a lot stronger than before. I've trained a lot. I can tell. Leon's nose twitched as he spoke to her. The more he interacted with her, the more he felt his chest grow heavy. Warning signs continued to ring inside of his mind, telling him that something was off, and he could only press down on his impulses by showing a fake and restrained expression. It was only after the two talked for a few more minutes that Aoife excused herself and sat down by herself while taking out the tablet to spectate the other matches. Leon took his eyes away from her, afraid of arousing any suspicion, and turned to look at Julian. He was just about to speak when he stopped. Sitting down with his head raised toward the platforms above, Julian's eyes flickered with strange colors as he looked absent-minded. He looked out of it, almost as if he was in a trance. It's like before. He had noticed this before during his fight against the Vice-Chancellor, but this time the colors that were shifting in his eyes were more prominent. He could see them vividly, and he felt a certain chill while staring into them. It almost felt as though he was being sucked into them. By the time Leon recovered, Julian's eyes turned to normal as his head turned to meet Leon's eyes. They stared at each other for a brief moment before Julian's lips opened. With the way that you're looking at me, I'd be more worried about you than Caius. Chapter 325. An abrupt situation. 1. 6 orbs appeared in my mind. They were all within arm's length. So long as I reached my hand, I'd be able to touch them. Standing before them, I felt the urge to touch them. I knew that something would happen were I to touch them, but I stopped myself. I knew that it wasn't time just yet. Looking around me, and seeing the darkness that enveloped the 6 orbs, I found myself shaking my head. There's so much missing. This was vastly different than what I understood about domains. What stood before me was merely the framework of what would later become my domain. I needed to expand the concept that stood before me before even remotely thinking about the last step, materialization. But that step seemed a distant one. For now, I could only focus on expanding the concept that was in front of me. Joy, rage, sorrow, affection, fear, shock. 6 words appeared beneath each orb. They each represented an emotion, but at the same time, 3 carried different meanings as opposed to the 6 main emotions. Why? Why was it like this? I stood in silence, pondering over what felt like forever. I could feel that the answer was at the tip of my tongue, and yet, each time I felt that I was close to the answer, my mind would blank. It was a frustrating process that repeated repeatedly until I was finally pulled away from my mind. I was close. Seeing Leon's face, I knew that I could only try next time. There was still another round of battles, and I couldn't carelessly handicap myself before the match. Taking a deep breath, I glanced his way. With the way that you're looking at me, I'd be more worried about you than Caius. All I felt were goosebumps with the way he was looking at me. Leon didn't say anything and just squinted his eyes. Eventually, he asked, "Were you practicing your domain?" How did he know? As if he could read my thoughts, Leon answered, "It's your eyes." My eyes. I took out a small reflective surface and looked at my reflection. Staring into those deep hazel eyes of mine, I turned back to look at Leon. What's wrong with my eyes? They're normal now. Then, they were changing color just a few moments ago when you were in a trance. I blinked my eyes, staring at my reflection once more. Changing color? In what way? No, I think I knew in what way. There were 6 different colors in the orbs. Perhaps the color change stemmed from each orb that resided within my consciousness. If that was the case, then it'd make sense. But outside of all of that, I suddenly grew curious about something as I turned to look at Leon, who was staring back at me with an impassive expression. Recalling how he had mentioned all of this, I suddenly realized something. You've developed a concept as well? That's a secret, Leon replied with a thin smile. A secret? What's this guy trying to do? The fact that he could more or less tell what was happening to me was a clear indication that he had at least developed an intent. Given his talent, it would make sense. But how far was he into developing his domain? Did he develop his concept? All of a sudden, a lot of questions popped up into my mind. The more I thought about them, the more my mind churned. I felt my chest grow heavy the more I thought about the situation. It was at this moment that I had a painful realization. If I don't develop something soon, then I'm afraid I won't make it far into the tournament. If Leon was able to develop a concept, then what stopped the others from doing so? In fact, it could be that I was lagging behind the others in this aspect. I thought I had done great by developing an intent so early, and it probably was a great achievement. Nonetheless, I had lagged behind the others in terms of progress. By the time I reached Tier 4, the others had reached it months before me. In such a situation, even though I developed an intent so early, they had all the time in the world to figure out their own intent and develop a concept. The realization made my chest grow heavy. "You're overthinking things." As if he could see through my thoughts, Leon spoke. When I turned to face him, he rubbed his hand over his shirt. An intent isn't something that can be developed or found just because you reach the 4th tier. It's something that occurs to you when your mind is ready. Regardless of how much talent you have, if your mind isn't ready, then you won't be able to develop an intent. What do you mean by your mind isn't ready? It means what it means. It's not something that can be explained with words, but you've already experienced it before. I'm not sure when you managed to find your intent, but I'm sure you felt that something was missing before you found it. Right? I blinked my eyes for a brief moment, recalling the time before the play. Indeed, there was a time back then when I felt that something was missing from me. It nagged the back of my mind and was what prompted me to unlock the love emotion. It was a weird situation that I couldn't quite explain, but it suddenly became clear to me. Could that be what he means? That I needed to figure out what was missing before an intent was created. In my case, it was the last emotion. That was the missing piece for the creation of my intent. Had I not performed in the play and unlocked the emotion, then I would have still been struggling to this day. Unless someone found out what they were missing, they wouldn't be able to unlock an intent. It looks like you realized. Leon smiled calmly. In my case, Leon stopped himself halfway, his face twitching as I pointed my finger at him. In your what? This guy, he said secret just a few moments ago, only to sell himself out in the next second. Leon didn't answer as his face twitched again. What's the point of resisting? Tisk, did you just click your tongue? Leon looked away and didn't answer. I was just about to speak again when I felt a small vibration in my pocket. The same was true for Leon as a cube materialized before the two of us. Oh, it looked like the sound round of fights was about to start. I had just turned my attention away from the cube to speak to Leon again when I noticed that he had already clenched it and disappeared. He ran away, didn't he? It had been a while since I found myself at a loss for words. Ha! In the end, with a long sigh, I could only shake my head and reach forward to grab the cube. A familiar sensation washed over me and I found myself appearing on one of the platforms at the top. It was one of the taller platforms, and from where I was, I could see the other platforms beneath. None of the platforms were on the same level, with some more elevated than the others. Looks like Leon got an easier opponent. He was standing opposite a face that I could recognize from the videos. He was a decent contender, but nowhere near Leon's level. Looking down, I could see more familiar faces appear. Kalian, Caius, Aoife, Amel. Gradually, all the top contenders appeared one by one. Seeing this, I sighed in relief, thinking that I'd have an easier draw, but the next moment, my heart sank. Kira stood at the opposite end, her long platinum hair cascading down her back, and her deep crimson eyes locked in a stoic gaze. She wore the familiar black uniform, her usual demeanor replaced by an unsettling calm. Following her appearance, the referee appeared as well. He stood in between us and glanced in our direction before raising his hand. Kira Milne from the Naz and Sifa Empire versus Julian Ivinus from the Naz and Sifa Empire. My muscles tensed, popping silently as I got into position and stared in Kira's direction. This fight, it was going to be extremely difficult. I needed to be ready. Glancing our way one more time, he threw his hand down. Begin. Moments prior, the studio picked up on the match between Julian and Kira immediately. The moment the two appeared, the broadcast started as Johanna and Carl started to introduce the two contestants. There was obvious excitement in this match. Who wouldn't be excited with the prospect of seeing two underdogs fight against each other? Noticing the boost in viewership, Carl's speaking became faster. On one side, we have Kira, who is the favored one in the match. Despite Julian's amazing performances as of late, he is the underdog in this match. It's funny. Carl laughed. The two of them both come from the same institute, and once, Julian was hailed as the #1 prospect. However, now things have changed. From the looks of things, he has fallen to 4th place in regard to the general rank between those of the same institute. Perhaps it was because of his injury, or perhaps other reasons, the others have caught up with him, alternating his gaze between the two contestants. Carl sighed. This match will be a heavy one for Julian. It'll determine if he'll ever get a chance to get his position back, or... Carl's words stopped halfway through. Just as he was speaking, the referee announced the start of the match. He, alongside Johanna and everyone that was watching, was expecting either Julian or Kira to start with an explosive move, but the scene shook everyone to the core. Looking in Julian's direction, Kira lowered her body. She then began to mumble something. Then, without hesitation, she turned back and jumped off the platform, flames appearing beneath her feet, decreasing the speed of her fall before she safely landed on the ground beneath as if it were nothing. In the silence that took over the studio and those watching the match, the referee's voice echoed. All hell broke loose shortly after that.